the members on that committee have been very active. We've got 9 members there, and they represent across the state fairly well, and they also represent both staff and board members of different SWCDs there. Myself and Correlia we're co-chairs, and Correlia really put a lot of time into helping us develop some of the early objectives and then other organization things we did with the committee. And then since then, Correlia has temporarily or has left the Jackson SWCD, but she remains on the committee as an active member. And I want to thank Jan Lee, for all the organization and the work she's put into different parts of this, including the guidebook. She's been just putting a ton of time in and is always available, and it's very nice to be working with her. So one of the first things the committee did was come up with a working lands definition, which Oregon doesn't really have a formal definition. And we reached out to the districts around the state to ask some input on what that would mean to them and what it really means for Oregon. And so that definition is here. The working lands are managed forest, rangelands, and farms, which may encompass natural habitat features such as wetlands, rivers, and coasts, which provide an abundance of natural resources for long-term agricultural, economic, and ecological benefit. So that survey that we put out to the districts, we got a fairly good response. A little over 70% of the districts responded to the questions that we put out. And we got some good feedback on how districts are involved with working lands. 54% of the districts had taken some kind of action in a working lands approach, with 2 of those districts that did respond have a formal working lands protection program. And we're going to hear from a couple of those later in the agenda. The top benefits of working lands that districts felt were important were healthy forests in watersheds for water quality and quantity protection. The number 2 thing was family farm preservation and conservation. And then the number 3 thing was building and maintaining ecosystem resiliency, in the face of climate change. So that kind of shaped some of the purpose and some of the topics that this committee focused on. The purpose of the committee we defined as promoting the protection of working lands and supporting conservation actions and providing information and resources to districts to move in that direction. The mission is to empower those district members to implement working land protections in their own communities. Then there's some bullets there, some specific things that we felt the committee could help or assist and support those districts in doing. And then the outcomes that we could see from this would be to provide that information and resources for districts, preserve working lands by active and successful project program implementation, and then help districts understand the tools and intended outcomes of working lands approach. And then, so this bullet list here is a lot of things that the committee kind of put on the plate to look at and develop what went into the guidebook. And those are really focused on basically natural resource protection and specifically protection of water quality and fish and wildlife habitat, preserving contiguous lands and reducing fragmentation of agricultural lands, and then protecting the heritage value of working lands. So that's kind of what the broad list of things that the committee looked at. And 2 of the products that have come out of this are, number 1, the Working Lands Guidebook, which Jan really took the lead on and putting together. And we put, the committee members put a lot of input into different sections of that. Jan will talk about that later in the agenda. And then this Working Lands Forum, we wanted to present this to the districts. So our agenda this morning looks like this. First, Jim Johnson is here from Oregon Department of Agriculture to talk about trends in land use. Then we have 3 speakers from land trusts and conservation entities that include Blue Mountain Land Trust, Ducks Unlimited, and Oregon Agricultural Land Trust. And then we have 3 examples of some working lands programs from 3 of the SWCDs. And then Jan will go through the guidebook that's been developed. With that, I'll stop sharing and let Jim Johnson take the stage there.
Thanks, Jim. Let's see if I can share this. Okay, hello everyone. I see a lot of old friends' names on the list. It's been a long time since I've seen a lot of you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Okay. What I wanted to do today was really talk about some of the things that I've discussed over the years with many of you out there, district folks that are have you know, started to develop easement programs and the like. And so with that in mind, really wanted to talk about, you know, the perspective of land use and what are working lands from the perspective of the land use planning program, and then some of the trends that you may want to consider when you're considering doing easements. So with that in mind, here we go. Here's what my agenda for today. I wanted to always start with a quick background in terms of what Oregon agriculture is, and many of you have seen me do this before, but this is going to be a shortened version of that. What are working lands, especially from the perspective of Oregon land use planning, and then some issues and trends that that we're dealing with in land use that implicate considerations of easements, use of easements. Oregon agriculture, of course, is very diverse. You all know this. We produce over 225 different commodities in the state. One of the top states in the country in terms of the number of commodities produced. That helps create a great stability throughout the industry over time. When one crop's down, another crop is usually carrying the water, so to speak, and filling in for that. We're a specialty ag state. We're not a commodity crop state for the most part. Yes, you know, we have a big chunk of wheat on the east side especially, but when you look at Oregon overall, we're a specialty crop state. And we also, as varied as we are and diverse as we are in crop production, you can match that with the varied size of farms and the methods of productions that we use in the state to produce those crops. So that diversity is a big plus. It's also a challenge when we're trying to deal with certain issues that we all deal with. Here's the top agricultural counties in the state. We all know that the Willamette Valley is kind of the industrial park, so to speak, of Oregon agriculture, but it's not all about the Willamette Valley. You can see in the top 5 we have 3 Eastern Oregon counties, and so agriculture can be very broad spread in certain parts of the state and very focused in others, and this list of counties really can show you that. Marion, of course, is always a perennial #1, but you know, when I first started working for ODA, gosh, 20 plus years ago now, I don't even believe Morrow County was on the list, or they were way down the list, and look at where they're at now. So it really goes to show you the changing character of agriculture and how different crops and practices can change that picture. Here's Oregon's top crops. This is just the new ODA list. We have a poster for anyone who would like to get a hold of this little poster or whatever. Let me know and I can see what I can do about that. It's also available online. Greenhouse and nursery, the perennial #1, or for the most part, cattle and calves has moved in and out of that. What I like to point out to people, especially when we're talking about what is agricultural land in Oregon, look at numbers 2, 3, and 4, cattle and calves, hay and milk. They're all livestock related. And if you combine those 3, they actually are bigger than greenhouse and nursery, which also is a combination of many different entities and crops and the like. And so the livestock industry is very, very important to the state of Oregon and really needs to be taken into account when you're considering viable agricultural operations and lands that need to be protected through one form or another, whether it be land use planning or easement or a combination of both. Just a couple of real quick highlights on there also. You'll see hazelnuts in there at number 10. That's been quite a change in the landscape in the Willamette Valley, especially. We're up to about 80,000 acres of hazelnuts now. Wasn't that many years ago that it was less than half of that. I saw Ken Bailey on the list. Cherries really had a good year last year, and they moved up into the top 10. They were a big mover. And then of course down on the bottom there, whatever, you can see Dungeness crab. The Oregon coast is just as important in terms of you know, the fishing industry as we are with the other aspects of agriculture. Quick list of what Oregon leads the nation in production of. You can see that specialty crop pointing through here. It's interesting to see some of these crops. When you look at Jefferson County, for example, and the carrot seed and the parsley seed and the garlic seed, they provide a high percentage of the world's specialty seed crops related to that. And so, you know, you can have your more common crops that people understand, but then you have a lot of specialty type crops like our seed crops that we grow in Oregon, our berry crops that are very unique to Oregon in many aspects. I also like to point out to people when we talk about the value of Oregon agriculture and protecting agricultural landscapes, unlike the value it is to the state economically. It's over 33 billion in terms of an economic footprint on the state. You can add to 31.1 billion in sales of goods and services related to agriculture. It's almost 15.5% of the state's economy. Over 20% of the jobs in Oregon have some relationship to agriculture. And just the value of agriculture at the farm gate, off the land, no added value, anything like that, is over $5 billion. So let's now jump into what we're really here to talk about, the land itself and the like. And this is an important graph. This is the Census of Agriculture, land and farms, 1954 to the most recent Census of Agriculture, which is 2017. We're going to be getting the new census information here in the next year or so. When you look at this, you can see this, you know, that after World War II and into the 50s, you can see there was a steep loss of farmland in Oregon, and we're still losing farmland, but that curve has really flattened. And the reason that flattened curve of course is when you look where it really starts to flatten in the early 70s and the like, that's when the Oregon land use planning program started and was becoming implemented. And so it really flattened the curve, but you can see we are still losing agricultural land, and I'll talk about some of those reasons when we get into some of the issues and the like. But this is an important thing to always keep in mind. So what are working ag lands? I'm going to focus on ag lands. Working lands, of course, include forest lands also and the like, but of course, I'm going to focus on ag lands. And so what are working ag lands? Let's take a look at our agricultural land base in Oregon. We've got 15.7 million acres that are actually in farm use. That's 26% of the state's land area. 9.1 million acres of those are range land. So remember that those numbers on the crops that we grow, the livestock and the like. That's an important element of the state's agricultural landscape and agricultural economy. 15.5 million acres are actually zoned as agricultural land under the statewide planning program. And we've got 13.1 million acres that receive special farm value assessment as land zoned for exclusive farm use. Remember, in Oregon, if you're zoned exclusive farm use, you automatically receive special farm value assessment if your land is currently employed in commercial agriculture. You don't have to prove up anything like you would on other zoned lands. And you have another almost 2.5 million, 2.4 million acres receive farm value assessment that aren't zoned EFU where they make the application. So that gets close right up there to that 15.7 million acres that are in farm use according to the Census of Agriculture. Let's look at the character of Oregon's farms. There's 37,616 total farms in the state of Oregon. 67% of those farms are 49 acres or less in size. These farms only account for 2.2% of the area of land in farms and only 9% of the production value. And the reason I point this out is a lot of people like to talk about the great number of small farms in Oregon, and that is an important element of Oregon agriculture. But when you look at the footprint of those smaller farms and you look at the production value, they're not the only or probably the major character of what Oregon agriculture really is. 72% of the area of land and farms in Oregon involves farms that generate $100,000 or more in income. And so, you know, what I'm getting at here again is you can't just look at the numbers of farms when you look at the character of agriculture in Oregon. You have to look at the footprint of those farms also. A key element in looking at any working landscapes and trying to decide, you know, what you're discussing or whatever is, of course, soils. And when you look at soils in Oregon and you look at, especially in the land use planning program, and you're doing analysis and the like, you're going to look at things like the U.S. Department of Agriculture's agricultural capability ratings. That's the NRCS capability 1 through 8. You're going to look at the USDA NRCS prime and unique ratings. Oregon high value farmland. Oregon high value farmland is defined in state statute and LCDC administrative rules to focus on one component of Oregon agricultural land. And high value farmland is really defined to include prime and unique, class 1 and 2, and certain 3 and 4 soils in the Willamette Valley. And then outside the Willamette Valley, prime and unique, class 1 and 2. It also focuses on irrigated lands, lands with water rights and lands within irrigation districts, and lands that involve perennial crops, and lands that are located within certain wine growing areas within the state of Oregon. So that's another tool to focus on some of the more highly productive agricultural lands. There are weaknesses with that definition. I've talked with many people in the ag community that point out to me that there are other areas that are producing high value crops that don't fall within that definition. And that is one of the issues that we deal with. And an example would be would be some of the dairies that are operating in Morrow County, for example. There's about 4.6 million acres of high value farmland soils in the state of Oregon. And remember, and I shouldn't say remember, I forgot to mention, high value farmland definition is a predominance test. So 50+% of soils within a tract, or if that tract contains that, then the whole tract is considered high value farmland. In terms of soils, there's 4.6 million acres of high value farmland soils, those soils that fit within the definition. 40% of those are located in the Willamette Valley. There's about 3.4 million acres of high value farmland soils that are located outside urban growth boundaries and actually zoned for agriculture. So you can see that number gets smaller when we start to focus on the lands that are actually zoned for agriculture, not within urban growth boundaries. And there's about 1.2 million acres of prime farmland in the state. 78% of that prime farmland is located within the Willamette Valley. Nearly 20% in the metro counties, Clackamas, Washington, Multnomah counties. This is really important because for reasons that some people don't think of, and that is the fact that there are a lot of highly productive agricultural lands in this state that are not considered prime farmland. They might be high value farmland or whatever. So that's really important to take into account when you're considering what are working lands in Oregon. Irrigation is really, really key in the state of Oregon. There's about 1.6 million acres of irrigated land in Oregon. So remember, that's of the 15 million acres of land and farms, 1.6 million acres of it is irrigated. So that's very, very focused. Irrigation is key because it enables more diversity of crops that can be grown on a farm. We've got a lot of issues going on right now with that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. 43% of all Oregon farms do some irrigation on their operation, not necessarily on their entire operation, but some form of irrigation within their operation. Irrigated farms produce 73% of the total value of Oregon's harvested crops. So you can see the importance of irrigation to the agricultural landscape in Oregon, especially as it relates to the economic impact. So quickly, let's switch over to the Oregon land use program and some key components that we consider when we're looking at working lands. the Oregon Agricultural Land Protection Program requires all counties to inventory their agricultural land based on a definition of what agricultural land is. Then they're required to protect that agricultural land for farm use using an exclusive farm use zone. And I'm not going to get into my land use 101 class too much today. So that's a whole nother presentation. And the program requires that urban development be contained within urban growth boundaries. And lastly, and this is just as important of an element of protecting farmland as those other elements that I just mentioned, but it's not thought of much, and that's appropriate level of rural services. Oregon's land use planning program does not allow urban level of services outside urban growth boundaries. You can't extend sewer and water outside of urban growth boundaries to promote urbanization or to promote higher levels of development unless there's a health hazard under the Oregon planning program. And that has been very key and important in protecting some landscapes from having that speculative land value and other issues related to urbanization that can be can lead to the ultimate loss of some pretty important farmland. So when you're looking at inventorying agricultural land in Oregon under the land use planning program, it's really based on primarily or firstly anyways, objective soil capability classifications. So it uses the NRCS ag capability classes. Class 1 through 4 soils are considered as a baseline for agricultural land in Western Oregon, class 1 through 6 soils in Eastern Oregon, and that 1 through 6 is important, recognizing the value of rangeland and also the value of certain lands that once they obtain water can become very valuable. And I always give this example. There are soils in the Columbia Basin that are class 6 and 7, but once they become irrigated, they can become class 3 and prime soils. So it's very, very important to recognize those very unique soils. The inventory also looks at the high value farmland definition that I mentioned. And because of this recognition of high value farmland and the differentiation between the Willamette Valley and Eastern Oregon, the program tries to recognize regional differences in agriculture in terms of soil capability around the state. Next, after looking at the soils, the inventory also looks at actual and historic use. You're going to find areas that may not meet the soils ratings capability classification definition, but still have historically been in farm use or actually are in farm use regardless of the soils type. And also look at the overall land use pattern. There are going to be lands that are considered prime farmland in terms of soils types, but they are parcelized and have dwellings on them. There's lots of examples of that around the state. You can see an area with prime farmland soils or class 3 soils or the like, and they're all parcelized up into 5-acre parcels with dwellings on those. So that existing land use pattern would not be considered agriculture, even though it meets the definition under soils capability. And those are what we call exception lands under the Oregon planning program. And a lot of those are your rural residential areas, your non-farm zone districts and the like around the state. Bottom line, this process to look at the capability versus the actual historic land use pattern and limitations of like, this really gets to the suitability of an area. And so if you have these areas that have quality soils yet are implicated by development patterns and other limitations and the like, it really gets to the suitability of the area. So there's the capability of the area, the actual physical characteristics, in a perfect world, can it be agricultural land, versus the suitability, the overlay of other factors that start to put limitations on that capability. And it really comes down to what's the integrity of the area, the overall integrity of an area to ultimately be long-term agricultural viable land. And that's gets to that exceptions process I talked about, but it's really key when we look at agriculture, we're looking at the capability and we're looking at the suitability of the land use in determining ultimately what should be protected as agricultural land. Okay, let's get into some issues and trends that are playing on the landscape and asking people, do we want to protect this land or not? In the impacts of development on agriculture, agricultural land are several. Of course, first there's the conversion, the loss of farmland, and there's also the loss of water. We always talk an awful lot about land, but more and more I'm concerned about land being converted from agriculture to other uses that has water rights, because as valuable as land is, there's even less water available for agriculture. And so we need to protect the water that agriculture currently has, because we're not going to get a lot more, if any. So it's not just a matter of conversion of land and water, but conversion of land, but also the matter of conversion of water and whether or not that water is available for agriculture. And when you're looking at conversion, you look at the quality of the land. Is it prime farmland? Is it high value farmland? Does it have some special characteristics that make it really productive agricultural land? So you're looking at the quality of land in terms of determining whether that conversion is an issue or not. But you're also looking at critical mass. How much farmland is needed in any given area of the state to support the agricultural industry, the agricultural infrastructure, how many farms does it take to support an irrigation district? How many farms, how much land mass does it take to support fertilizer and pesticides dealers in the area and the like? That agricultural infrastructure is really, really important. You also look at, when you're looking at development on ag land, non-farm development, what is the impact on the ability of farm and ranch operations to continue to operate? What's the shadow that's cast by that development on surrounding farms and ranches? Does it start to implicate their ability to conduct common and accepted farming practices? Can you spray pesticides? Can you conduct your operations without trespass and littering and the like? There's a whole list of those things, and we get into some of that under right to farm laws also. But ultimately, regardless of right to farm or land use, if a farmer it's just limiting his abilities to efficiently and effectively farm, that's what I like to call shadow conversion. And then what's the footprint of that actual development? We're hearing more and more about this with energy facility siting, and how large is the footprint and how much land are we actually losing? And the shadow conversion that I talked about. So you have the actual footprint, that loss of land, the conversion, and then you have the shadow that's cast by the development that could also start to implicate other operations, which could be shadow conversion. So footprint versus shadow conversion, they're both ways that we lose farmland in Oregon. And then cumulatively, this is something that's a real issue, and I think I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But what's the cumulative impact of multiple non-farm development? It's one thing to have one solar facility in a county, but what's the impacts of a solar facility, 2 new recreational developments, 15 new non-farm dwellings? You get the idea. What's the cumulative impact of non-farm development on agricultural land? And that needs to be better considered when we're looking at impacts to loss of farmland and loss of critical mass of farmland needed to support the industry. So let's look at some issues here. The exclusive farm use zone, which is used to protect farmland in Oregon, is really not that exclusive. There's over 50 non-farm uses that are allowed in the exclusive farm use, or may be allowed in the exclusive farm use zone through a conditional use process. And that gets to some of the day-to-day issues that we're all dealing with in terms of the land use program and the siting of these such things. And issues related to non-farm development include supersiding. It seems like every legislative session there's a proposal to put something out on farmland without going through any process that would allow the farmers and ranchers to be involved in discussing the implications on the subject landscape. Definitions. What is a park? There are many land uses within the planning program that are listed, but they're not defined, and so that leaves it open to some kinds of interpretations. And you would not believe the things I've seen around the state being proposed on farmland under the guise of being called a park, for example. And there's several other land uses that aren't defined, but that's a real important definition. Siting standards. A lot of non-farm uses are reviewed. It's kind of a all or nothing kind of thing. Are they allowed or they're not? But what about if they're allowed subject to certain standards, like setbacks from edges that are shared with farm use, for example? Under current law, there's really no requirements for siting standards for non-farm uses, and that's something that we need to look at. Specific land uses I'm going to talk about in a second that are having issues out there. And then cumulative impacts. What is the cumulative impact on agriculture when you start to look at not one or two non-farm uses, not three or four that all to get together may not have a big impact on agriculture, but those in combination with all the existing non-farm uses that are already out there? What's the cumulative impact on agriculture? What happens when every one of those non-farm residences out there, for example, puts a straw down into the aquifer with an exempt water right, so to speak, and there's no consideration of the implications to the surrounding farming operations? What's the cumulative impact? I mentioned, the 50 plus non-farm uses in the EFU zone. Started out with 6 non-farm uses when the EFU zone was first created. Now it's plus 50. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This is a little bit wonky for land use planners, but when you look at the exclusive farm use zone, there's 2 sets of uses, and this is important when you're looking at the review criteria. The sub 1 uses, the first set of uses, are subject to state law only. They're supposed to be farm related or more compatible with farm use. I would debate that with some of the uses, but that's the idea there. And then the sub 2 uses are the uses that state law requires the farm impacts test. That's for those of you that know, the 215-296 test that was recently defined better by the Supreme Court out of the Yamhill County Stop the Dump case. But this is the set of uses that counties can be more restrictive on. They can add to review criteria to those uses, or they can even propose to not even allow those uses at all within the exclusive farm use zone. So these are the kinds, when you're looking at agricultural lands within your specific area, considering easements and the like, look at what uses may or may not be allowed within your jurisdiction in terms of the exclusive farm use zone. I will tell you right up front, I don't know of too many counties that have a more restrictive EFU zone than is allowed by state law, but there are some counties that do regulate the sub 2 uses in a greater standard than state law, and that can have a play in terms of your determinations of impacts to agriculture. And that last line there, Brent Marr distinguishes between the two. This is more for a planning discussion, but Brent Marr is an important court case that basically said you can't be more restrictive than state law for those sub 1 uses. So specific land uses that we're having issues and trends with that people ask me about more and more as it relates to do we need added protection using easements because the planning program isn't doing the job. Energy facility siting, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. Everything from wind farms to solar and pipelines to transmission lines. Non-farm residential, a big issue in Central Oregon. Wetlands. Wetlands is a non-farm use that for the most part around the state is basically permitted outright in the exclusive farm use zone without consideration of any impacts to surrounding farm operations. It became such a big issue on the Oregon coast, especially in Tillamook County, that the legislature did implement a pilot program where wetlands now go through a review process for to consider their implications to surrounding farming operations. And in my opinion, that so far has been a very successful process. The farmers have been able to talk about the implications of converting farmland to wetlands, not only in terms of conversion, but in terms of that shadow that's cast onto their farms in terms of potential, things like more flooding and the like. So, and then of course, open space, recreation, lots of issues with trails, parks, agritourism being sited on farmland. Energy facility siting, there's your big solar farm. That's actually is located within an irrigation district of the North Unit Irrigation District in Central Oregon. speculative land values. A lot of times you're dealing with landowners who aren't the operators. So they're looking at making the most money, not necessarily maintaining the land in farm use. It also increases the speculative and land values so that the farmers in the area can't compete with the energy facility siting. Dual use, temporary use. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but a lot of solar folks are saying, oh, we'll do agriculture underneath solar panels. Yeah, well, I'd like to see them run a 60-foot header through, a solar farm or grow perennials in a solar farm. Off-site trespass related to runoff, erosion, air. These are the kinds of issues that we're dealing with in energy facility siting, and have started to have people think about using easements where this is becoming an issue. And then ability to farm. What are the edges of that energy facility siting deal in terms of its relationship with surrounding agriculture? And the old cumulative impacts. How many can go in before they start to impact the critical mass needed in an area to support agriculture? Big issue, urban growth. I talked to a lot of people about using easements in terms of urban growth. As good as the Oregon planning program is, urban cities are required to plan for a 20-year land supply. So ultimately, you're going to see expanding urban growth boundaries. So do we need to do more coordinated population allocation like they do in the Portland area? Should there be better use of buffers on the edges? What about infrastructure? What about super siting? And I want to get this done here because I think I'm running out of my time. Trends. UGB expansions. Most of the UGBs in this state are 30, 40 years old. So we're going to be seeing more proposals for expansions. Water supply and climate change, dealing with a lot of issues with water supply around the state and their implications on the viability of agriculture and the like. Some of these droughts and disasters that we're seeing, I'm starting to question, are these really droughts or disasters, or is this the new normal, especially in certain parts of the state where it's happening year after year? And so we need to start to make those kind of considerations. Local food. Seeing a lot more emphasis on local food. So areas that may have not been considered suitable for agriculture in the past are being utilized now. Smaller parcels and the like, really focused on local food supply and such. I've seen areas in Central Oregon, for example, and around the Portland metro area that are zoned rural residential that are now commercial ag lands. And then what about new crops? What has hazelnuts done to the Willamette Valley? What has cannabis done to Oregon? That's a whole nother presentation, but you need to look at things like that when you're considering a long-term viability of agriculture. Oops. And I think that'll do it, Jan. If you all need to get a hold of me, here's my contact information. And I don't think we have time for questions, but if so, I'm here. So sorry to hurry through this.
Well, all right. Thanks, Jim. That was a really good rundown, and a lot of statistics there, a lot of information. Very good. We'll have some question time at the end of this next session, but right now we'll move on to the series of land trusts and conservation entities. We've got a little bit of a change in the lineup. Our first speaker is going to be Genevieve Perdue from Blue Mountain Land Trust. Their main office is located in Walla Walla, Washington. They work in Northeast Oregon and Southeast Washington. So Genevieve, if you have a PowerPoint you'd like to share.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for the introduction, Jim. I had actually sent my PowerPoint along. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Looks good. So yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Genevieve Perdue. I'm the conservation specialist with Blue Mountain Land Trust, and I'm based in John Day, Oregon. Before I get started on my own presentation, I just wanted to give a quick rundown of what you all can expect for the next hour or so. Myself, Kelly Warren of Ducks Unlimited, and Nellie McAdams of Oregon Agricultural Trust worked together to try and cover an array of topics relating to conservation easements that would be most relevant to a conservation district audience. So we're all going to give an overview of our various entities, and then I'm going to talk about what a conservation easement is and how conservation easements can be useful to landowners. And I apologize if any of that is a little bit repetitive. I I wasn't here for the previous presentation and it sounded like conservation easements were touched upon. Kelly Warren is going to talk about conservation benefits of easements. And then Nellie is going to talk about land use considerations in Oregon, SWCD roles and opportunities, and then advocacy for various grant programs. Okay, yeah, and then we'll have questions at the end. So if we could move to the next slide. Thank you. So my agenda is who is the Blue Mountain Land Trust? What are conservation easements? How are they valued? What does the process look like? And what are the benefits of conservation easements? Next slide. Thank you. The Blue Mountain Land Trust's mission is to work with communities and landowners to conserve the scenic, natural, and working lands that characterize the Blue Mountain region. Next slide. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're nationally accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. We were founded in 1999 in Walla Walla, Washington. And then in 2017, we expanded into the John Day Basin. Next slide. Thank you. So as you can see here, we work in 11 counties across southeastern Washington and eastern Oregon. And our work revolves around protecting fish and wildlife habitat, as well as working farms and ranches throughout these counties. We currently hold 16 conservation easements totaling over 13,500 acres. And then this past summer, we actually bought our first fee simple property, and that's 278 acres here in Grant County. Next slide. So what is a conservation easement? It is a voluntary agreement between a landowner and a qualified entity that creates permanent limits on the use of the land. Typically, a conservation easement will limit the right to subdivide and develop the property. And through this process, the landowner retains the title as well as any right that was not rescinded in the conservation easement agreement, and the land remains in private ownership and can be sold, leased, or inherited. Next slide, please. Conservation easements can be pretty tailored to meet a landowner's plans and needs for their own land. And that involves the landowner and the easement holder spending a good amount of time working together to ensure that we've determined the future land use that works best for the landowner. And then working lands conservation easements can protect a farm or ranch from development and subdivision while also allowing the land's productive uses to continue. Next slide. There's a number of benefits to conservation easements for farmers and ranchers and landowners in general. And those include succession planning, financial, land protection, and stewardship benefits. Next slide. Before we dive into each benefit individually, I thought it would be helpful to talk about how a conservation easement is valued. So let's say hypothetically, Harry and Rachel have a farm that is worth $4 million unencumbered, and that $4 million figure would be determined by an independent appraiser, not the land trust and not the landowner. So then say removing the right to subdivide and develop the property, the appraiser determines that the value is now $3 million if the property is encumbered by a conservation easement. So we would take the current value of the land and subtract the value of the land with an easement on it, and that would be the market value of the easement. So in this case, that would be 4 million minus 3 million, gives us a $1 million easement value. Next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, a conservation easement can be beneficial for succession planning. When the value of the property is decreased through a conservation easement, that can also ease the estate tax burden. And in the case where a landowner might not be planning to leave their property to an heir, It can also decrease the purchase price for a future farmer or rancher trying to get their foot in the door. Next slide. Thank you. There are also financial benefits, which can include an upfront payment to a landowner or an income tax savings, depending on the funding arrangement, which we'll go into in the next slide. So one option for funding an easement is by purchasing that conservation easement. And the way that works is typically through state or federal dollars. Here in Oregon, the funders we have available to us, or the biggest funders I'll say, are the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. I've also listed the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program here, which is not yet set up to fund conservation easements, but we're hoping to get it to that point, and Nellie McAdams is going to talk about that one a little more. But going back to NRCS and OWEB, they each fund a percentage of a conservation easement. So there are instances where we choose to use both funders to reach that 100% funding of a conservation easement. And so this is the case in which there would be upfront money to the landowner. And in the case that only one funder was chosen, only a percentage of the easement value would be paid to the landowner. Next slide. Another option is a donated conservation easement. So that would mean the landowner is donating the value of the conservation easement. And that is where the income tax savings come in. A qualified rancher or farmer can deduct their income taxes for up to 15 years. And according to the Land Trust Alliance, a qualifying farmer or rancher is someone who receives more than 50% of their gross income from the trade or business of farming. And it's important to note here that as a land trust, we would always suggest that a landowner talk to a tax lawyer or a CPA to ensure that a donated or a funded easement is right for them. Next slide. So the last two benefits that I mentioned are land protection and stewardship. So a conservation easement does protect the land permanently, and then we do that through stewardship and management. So the way this works is that an easement holder, such as Blue Mountain Land Trust, would monitor the property annually to ensure that the conservation easement agreement is being adhered to. And then conservation easements are often also subject to a management plan, and that plan is agreed upon between the landowner, the land trust, and any funders involved, and is subject to change. Typically, we update a management plan every 5 years, but that can happen more often. And the goal there is just to make sure that a management plan stays relevant to the conditions on the ground. Next slide. So here's an example process for a conservation easement in Oregon. We would start off by planning with the landowner and talking about what their goals are for their property, what type of funding they'd like to seek, whether they'd like to donate the value of the conservation easement. So in this case, let's say the landowner chooses and the property is the right fit for an OWEB and NRCS joint funding opportunity. So that might look like applying for OWEB funding in fall and then NRCS funding in spring. And if we were successful in acquiring both sources, we would move into this big block called closing on the right side. And that involves a lot of different steps. It involves due diligence, the appraisal. It involves drafting the conservation easement document itself, the management plan, the baseline conditions, documenting all of those and writing them up. And so this timeline suggests that this process would take 2 years, but it can often also expand past 2 years, especially with multiple funders involved, because there's just so many parties at play with different priorities that all have to work together. Next slide. So the rights that continue to be allowed under a conservation easement can be farming, grazing, residents, the construction of new buildings even. And the way that works is that we would pre-identify a building envelope with the landowner, map it, document it, everything. And that is where a landowner could build something in the future if they wanted to. A landowner can sell their property or transfer the property, and the rights that are restricted are subdivision.
Welcome. This truck knows its way to Home Depot and Jerry's and back.
All the places I go to. Thanks.
Eric, can you mute yourself? Thank you. So yeah, going back to the rights that are restricted, that would be property subdivision and any development outside of the building envelope, and any other items that the landowner specified they wanted to be restricted. Next slide. So in addition to landowner benefits, there's a number of community benefits, which include the protection of viable farms and ranches, wildlife habitat, clean water, and recreation. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I think we're actually going to keep questions for the end, but you are more than welcome to email me at the address provided here if you would like any more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. That was very good. We'll have questions at the end of this session. So our next speaker is Kelly Warren. He's a regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited based out of Vancouver, Washington. And Kelly, welcome. And you have a slideshow or something you'd like to share?
Looking to request control, and then I will get going.
Okay. I think right on the bottom of your screen, there's a screen share button.
Got it.
Perfect.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I am Kelly Warren. I'm a Western Oregon regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited. I'm located near Corvallis, Oregon, and I've been working for Ducks Unlimited for a little over 3 years, working on building their Western Oregon program. I have a counterpart in Eastern Oregon that focuses, he's out of Boise, and he focuses in the Harney, Klamath, and Lake County regions. So who is Ducks Unlimited? Ducks Unlimited started in 1937, and our mission is to fulfill the annual life cycle needs of North American waterfowl by restoring, protecting, enhancing, and managing important wetlands and associated uplands. These are also habitats that benefit other wildlife and people. Wetlands, for example, have a lot of different benefits that directly correlate to water, and water is something in the West that we value greatly, especially after a year like this. We also are a large partner and advocate for the agricultural community all across the, North America, both in Canada, the US, as well as Mexico. And part of the reason for that is agricultural provides half of all the food sources available for migratory birds. And that is even more critical in the Pacific Flyway, where we are one of 4 flyways. But we also host some species that directly benefit from all of the agricultural that happens in California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as some of the other states. DU has conserved more than 15 million acres in North America. DU is the 3rd largest land trust in North America. We hold easements all across the nation, and we are accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. DU does not permanently hold fee simple. Usually in a crunch situation, we will assist with transactions and potentially hold title temporarily until we can find a different land trust or soil and water conservation district to hold those projects long-term. In Oregon, DU holds 6 easements on wetlands totaling around 622.5 acres. One of those is in Klamath, one in Yamhill, 3 in Marion, and 1 in Columbia County. First, I'm going to touch on Chris Colson's area over in Eastern Oregon. This area is referred to as the Sonic, and that stands for Southern Oregon and Northeast California Priority Waterfowl Landscape. Now, one thing I do want to make clear is that Ducks Unlimited is not a purely migratory bird focused. We focus more on water and wetlands. And yes, we do keep track of waterfowl, but it is more of the biodiversity and focusing on habitats and water that benefits fish, waterfowl, and other wildlife sources. The Sonic supports 70% of migratory waterfowl in the Pacific Flyway, and a large majority of those are the northern pintail, which is a species of critical focus for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and many of the flyways in North America. Their population is struggling, and so it is a population, and in the Pacific Flyway, it is not. So the Sonic is a critical region for northern pintail. In the fall, a lot of the waterfowl that migrate down and usually end up in Northern California or the Sacramento Basin benefit from publicly owned managed wetlands. However, in the spring, a lot of their food resources are in flood irrigated and wet meadows and floodplains, so private lands and ranches. In the Sonic, bioenergetic demand is met for female body condition. So there has been studies done that show increasing nest success because of the food benefits that are found in this region. The population objectives are limited by fall migration resources and increasingly water limited landscapes. Drought and other things definitely play a significant role in the success of a lot of these species. So what is important is sustaining a lot of these flood irrigated practices. So we assist with producers and ranchers with funding, permitting, design, and revenue. Conservation easements in the region, development pressure is relatively low. DU interest is mostly in maintaining larger ownerships to more easily facilitate water use and efficiency improvements. So a lot of Chris's focus is on assisting ranchers and others with making their water systems more efficient while maintaining that flood irrigated practice. And currently DU's role is facilitating a lot of those easements, and that usually is incorporated in NACA funding, North American Wetland Conservation Act funding. And we are looking at a larger model for holding conservation easements where there may not be other entities that that can hold easement in certain regions where there may not be land trust capacity or others that will hold time. So primarily, we work on refurbishing flood irrigation infrastructure, restoring and optimizing floodplain hydrology, integration of fish passage and screening, floodplain and wet meadow restoration, a lot of farm bill partnership biologists in Lake and Harney counties delivering EQIP infrastructure projects, mostly correlated to that flood irrigation, and exploring expansion of this platform to other Eastern Oregon landscapes. Now, when I'm working in Western Oregon, Eastern Oregon has definitely found a niche as far as conservation easements and potential opportunities. In Western Oregon, it's a bit there's still a long way to go into finding where those niches might be. So we currently we assist partners and private landowners in water and wetland conservation management and efficiency. And that can include state, federal, tribal, soil and water conservation districts, and others. In addition to me, there are other staff that help Chris and I with project delivery. We have engineers, drafters, and permitters on staff. And then we also usually fulfill a role of grant administration and by writing NACA grants and bringing federal money to the table to supplement a lot of those state funding that Genevieve talked about in her presentation. And then we're looking to increase cooperative efforts with the agricultural community. As you heard from Jim earlier, there's a lot of changes happening with agriculture in the Willamette Valley, and tracking those and supporting some of those agricultural practices that are beneficial to waterfowl and wetlands is a niche we're looking to fill. So how we partner with current SWCDs in Western Oregon. We are a part of the Willamette Main Stem Cooperative with Benton SWCD. We are part of the Oak and Prairie Focused Investment Partnership with Benton, Polk, Yamhill, and Tualatin, and growing relationships in the Willamette Valley and the coast, looking to fill capacity, project delivery, funding, and acquisition needs. So as far as future opportunities, looking to increase capacity in Western Oregon, promotion of grass seed and row crop agriculture, important to hydrology and food sources. And then tide gate projects is something that we've recently been focusing on the coast and are in process of delivering a major project on the coast. And that includes a tide gate working group that OWEB has put together. There's been some funding that has come to the table to assist private landowners and as well as permanently protected lands with replacement of tide gates that may not be working. And that is a niche that seems to need filled on the coast as far as project delivery and potential acquisition. NACA is something that we will be taking on in the Willamette and the coast. And what that usually includes is taking numerous projects and putting in a $1 million grant that can bring money to projects and even acquisitions or conservation easements that can benefit private landowners as well as soil and water conservation districts and other entities in the region. So the benefits of conservation easements. It's a tool for farmers and SWCDs in this region. Basically, you can customize your conservation easements. As Genevieve referred to, it can be complicated, it can be timely. And so it is important for a landowner to know all of their options and customize what that conservation easement will look like so it can fit their needs the best. And one thing we definitely want to focus on is farming the best and get rid of the rest. So if there is non-high quality farmland that gets inundated every year and it is a struggle for the farmer, a conservation easement may be something that can benefit that farmer by taking or putting that under a conservation easement so they can take their money and invest it elsewhere. We want the farmers to meet their personal and or organizational goals. Financial compensation is obviously a big factor in conservation easements. And then tax incentives is definitely something that is more attractive. And in the Willamette Valley, as we see land prices increasing, financial compensation and tax incentives definitely seem to be something that is more attractive. And semi-permanent or perpetual protection of land protects critical habitats, easier to assist in listed species recovery. If you have land in a conservation easement, it is usually easier to get funding for restoration or other factors. And then really threatened landscapes, like in the Willamette Valley, for example, oak and wetlands are something that are increasingly rare with urbanization and changing over land priority. And make sure we're keeping some of these farming things functioning for flood irrigation. So one of the funding sources that I did refer to earlier is NACA. That's a North American Wetland Conservation Act. There's 2 cycles per year, February and July. Up to $1 million can be asked for from NACA. And ideally, you're bringing $2 million in match. That will definitely make your application more competitive. However, it is not required. There can be other factors like the projects themselves that can raise the bar of that application. Oregon is an increasingly important region because of migration change and wetland threat. Now, on the right side of my screen, those are the goals for NACA: protect, enhance, restore, and manage, maintain, and sustain. Wetlands all across the nation are something that are disappearing, and keeping those wetlands for the future, both for people benefit and wildlife benefit, is critical. And DU supports our partners with NACA by being a grant administrator or increasing capacity or project delivery in that region.
All right, thanks, Kelly. That was great. So again, we'll have questions in after the session, and the next speaker is Nellie McAdams from Oregon Agricultural Trust.
Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I am Nellie McAdams. I'm with the Oregon Agricultural Trust. We are also a 501c3 land trust like the other two presenters. Our mission is to partner with farmers and ranchers to protect agricultural lands for the benefit of Oregon's economy, communities, and landscapes. So we do exclusively easements that protect and allow agriculture to remain on agricultural lands. In addition to doing easements and protecting agricultural land, both in easement and fee title, we also provide technical assistance to other working land easement holders or entities, including SWCDs that want to hold easements. We also provide education for landowners, so farmers and ranchers, but also their service providers. That includes the attorneys, accountants, and appraisers who are critical not only to easement transactions, but also to succession planning. And as Genevieve pointed out, easements can be a great tool for succession planning. So we're trying to help landowners integrate this as well as possible into their larger business plans. We also advocate for programs and funding to protect agricultural land, and I'll be speaking about that in a bit. We generally operate in areas where there are no local easement holders that specialize in agricultural easements. So for right now, that's the North Coast, Mid and South Willamette Valley, the Gorge, Mid-Columbia, and Southeast Oregon. We can operate throughout the state, but those are our focal areas. So I am mainly going to focus on three nuances and questions that have come up from what I understand from committee members in terms of how easements operate and how SWCDs and the larger community can engage. So one of those is the challenge of creating attractive easement valuation in Oregon, given our land use program. The other is the roles that SWCDs can play in easements, both as a partner or as an easement holder, and then opportunities for funding and how that advocacy is rolling out. So, as Genevieve mentioned, I'm just going to go a little bit into the valuation piece of easements in order to talk about how the situation in Oregon is a little bit unique. So with an easement, a land trust begins by looking at all of the available property rights, and that can be availability to build housing or a golf course or aggregate mining or Measure 49 rights. And the land trust or SWCD sits down with the landowner, talks about which easement, which land uses they want to retain and which ones they might want to convey through a conservation easement and permanently remove from the property. So those rights are specified in the easement. They're removed. They're held by the land trust or SWCD in perpetuity to ensure that they're not used in the future. But the landowner retains the rest of those property rights, the bundles of sticks that were not included and specified in that easement. And as Genevieve mentioned, the valuation of an easement starts with the value of the property as is, with all of the development rights still on it. Then there's a second appraisal that determines the value of the property once the easement has been conveyed. And then the easement is the difference between those two appraisals. So in this situation, if the property was worth $1 million to start with, it was worth $750,000 after the easement restricted some of those development rights, then the easement would be worth the difference of those two, so $250,000. So, that brings up the question of, in Oregon, our exemplary land use program limits the rights, the development or non-farm rights that are allowed on agricultural land, and provides a great baseline for the state. But that means that there are fewer development rights to remove by easement, which means that the easement is consequently usually worth a little bit less or a lot less in Oregon than in other states. I have seen appraisals of easement value ranging from 48% of the total property value, and that might be right near an urban growth boundary, to 25 to 20% in other areas, and potentially even lower depending on what development rights are there to be removed. So there are about 60 non-farm uses that are permitted by statute on exclusive farm use land, and some of those have an appraisable value. Some of them might not have much of an appraisable value. It depends on the property. But some development rights that can be removed in Oregon for significant value is, if the land is in close proximity to an urban growth boundary, depends on the appraiser, but they might find that it is more likely to be fragmented. The appraiser needs to look at the development rights that are currently available on that property, but there might be a little bit of gray area there. We've also found that landowners who have vested Measure 49 rights, which allow residential development, those, if they are still valid, can be removed and can have significant value for the landowner. And then there are rights like removing ability to have solar or wind installations on that property, which can also provide additional value. So it's not like the easement isn't worth anything, but it depends upon what the landowner is looking for. I find that landowners I speak with are often, they're doing an easement because they love the land and they want to leave a legacy. The valuation of the easement determines how we do the easement. These are long processes, as Genevieve explained, can take up to 4 years if you're using state and federal funding or any funding that's available. So landowners who do this are usually in it for the long haul, and the financial gain usually isn't the only reason why they're doing it. And it probably isn't that wise to engage with a landowner who's only doing this to dig themselves out of debt. That might not be the best long-term partner. So having their heart in it is important, but then looking at that valuation, deciding if it's worth it for the landowner, and if it might be competitive for funding, are other considerations for both the land trust and the landowner. I also want to say that, I am extremely glad that we have a land use program. I wouldn't trade that for the world. And in fact, if you look at Maryland, which doesn't really have much land use, if any, they have a strong easement program, but in some cases, when an easement is conveyed near an urban growth boundary, the values of the properties all around it go sky high for development because everybody wants a free park. It's a farm that they can look at. So the land use program provides an excellent baseline for land protection. Easements can help bolster that and add a layer of permanence to that protection, because the land use program really only slows the pace of development. Development can be allowed and UGBs can be expanded, from mountain range to mountain range, depending upon political will. But easements add a layer of permanence and add a shadow layer of protection to the properties around them. So it certainly is a worthy endeavor, even though we have a land use program. It just adds a little bit of a nuance to that. The second point that I wanted to go over was the roles of an SWCD in easement conveyance. The first is the most obvious. SWCDs are allowed to hold easements, and that was allowed by statute, and actually OACD and SWCDs advocated to include SWCDs as a named easement holder. So that is a benefit that SWCDs have. And there are SWCDs with programs, you'll be hearing about them right after our presentation here, including East Multnomah, Yamhill, Clackamas, who's working on their program in Tualatin. And other SWCDs do hold easements. So they might not have an active program, but they might have agreed to hold an easement at some point in the past. So there is much to learn from your peers. SWCDs, especially those with a tax base, can also play the role of a funder. So, an easement program is a lot of overhead. It costs $40,000 to $50,000 to complete each easement transaction. Those are the transaction costs, including appraisal and survey and attorney's fees and staff. So these are not inexpensive, and the expertise that you need to have on staff is usually needs to be highly trained and experienced. So it might not be something that an SWCD, especially an SWCD without a tax base, might want to tackle. However, if an SWCD has funding, especially if it does have that funding to share, a grant program could be an option for supporting easement holders in your service area, among your constituents, to hold easements on your behalf. So that is an option. Another option is to partner with local land trusts to help with outreach, to connect landowners you speak with to those land trusts, or to help provide education, to let them know that this service is available in their area. And then, as Kelly mentioned, there are a number of different partnership grants that either the SWCD or the land trust or other partner could hold that could include acquisition funding. And so that could provide a broader suite of funding options for multiple partners to protect and conserve land. And then advocacy. So OACD has been a wonderful partner on advocacy efforts, especially at the state and federal level. So just to let you know, President Grigsby and Jan helped to shepherd through a policy at NACD that was in support of increased federal funding for easements in the next Farm Bill. And OECD has been at the table to develop, implement, and advocate for the state funding match program. Oops. So sorry, I had a notice come up. So moving on to those funding types. When we look at funding an easement transaction, we're often looking at multiple funding sources plus landowner donation. This is how it often works for a working lands easement, is that 50% to 75% comes from the federal source, ASAP-ALE, which is the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, Agricultural Land Easements. So a little bit redundant, but I'm just going to call it ASAP-ALE to make it easier. And then often the landowner makes some kind of a charitable, of a donation of easement value, for which they're eligible for charitable tax deduction. And farmers and ranchers in particular can spread out that tax deduction over 15 years and use it as needed. So that is a tremendous benefit of easement donation. In fact, some easements are 100% donation. But often some of the funding comes from a non-federal source. So ASAP-AL can only match with a non-federal source. I'll be talking about Oregon's work on our non-federal source in a second, but first I'm going to speak to partnership advocacy for the federal program ASAP-AL. Now, this program has had $450 million per year allocated to it in the most recent Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill. But in the infrastructure funding package that Congress is considering, in recent reports, I've seen up to $1.7 billion for ASAP and more for the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which can include ASAP-AL funding. So that could be a huge above the line addition to those Farm Bill funds. But as we look towards 2023, a number of advocacy groups are looking to double or triple that ASAP funding to $900 million or $1.3 billion in that Farm Bill program. And you know, the $450 million sounds like a lot, but it's only meeting 1/3 of current demand. So it could definitely stand to increase. Another sort of policy ask that we're making is that some of the funds be allowed to be used for those project costs. As I mentioned, a project can cost $40,000 to $50,000, including staff and contractor fees. So, you know, some projects might not be done depending upon the land trust or SWCD's budget, but for having those project costs in hand. And then we're also advocating to bring dollars into Oregon. So at the federal level, NRCS determines how much funding goes to each state that they can then distribute among applicants. And this year, Oregon only received $500,000, which is, you know, Oregon's only received 0.4% of ASAP-AL funding over the last 20 to 30 years. So we can stand to do better. And over 10 times that amount was requested in applications this year. So there certainly is demand. I lastly wanted to show these partners who OAT is working with in order to advocate for federal funding, in addition to NACD. The state match program is the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program. It's designed to match with ASAP-AL, but it can actually provide up to 75% match. So it can go beyond ASAP's 50. Not that landowner would be paid more than 100%, but you know, if ASAP isn't available for that full 50, it can pay more. It was passed by the legislature in 2017, yet it is currently unfunded, the grants programs. It has rules and a commission and is ready to go, but it just has not received the funding for the grants themselves. And you know, as a result, we have been passing up federal funds that have been on the table, and states with funded match programs have historically leveraged 3.7 times more in federal dollars than those like Oregon without a funded match program. So for example, Delaware has received 8.5 times as much funding from this program as Oregon. So looking at advocacy for OAHP, in the short session, a coalition of partners, including OACD, is requesting $5 million for this program. That would primarily go to 2 programs listed under OAHP. So it has actually 4 grant programs: easements, implementation of conservation management plans, so paying landowners for conservation practices on the ground, succession planning and technical assistance to organizations including SWCDs. This funding request would mainly be for the first 2 programs, easements and implementation of conservation management plans. It would also, of course, fund OWEB administration, which could be pretty costly since they're going to be putting this program together. And since they can't use their lottery funds to pay for this, OWEB lottery funds can only be used for grant programs and administration that focus exclusively on fish and wildlife habitat and water quality. And since OAHP also focuses on agricultural values, it's not eligible for those lottery funds. So that's why we need to go to the legislature. And there is significant demand for this program. So OWEB looked at demand in 2019 and found that there were 28 projects from 11 easement holders that would have protected 76,000 acres. And the cost was, over 50 million. So there is significant demand for this program. And that was, 2 years have passed and more projects are being developed. And there will be a larger funding request in 2023, but I will leave that as a TBD until we get to that point. I wanted to share the logos of the partners who are part of the core coalition working on OAHP here as well. So there we go. Sorry for the speedy run through. I do have a hard stop in 4 minutes. So we are at Q&A. I can, if anybody has any questions for me about my part of the presentation, it might be good to start there since I will have to leave in 3 minutes now.
All right, thanks a lot, Nellie. Does anybody have any questions, especially for Nellie? You can use the raise your hand reaction if you'd like, or type it into the chat box.
Yes, Michael?
Hi, thanks a lot. I was just, I guess, kind of curious about how you work in certain areas. Like I work with the Benton Soil and Water Conservation District, and we have Greenbelt Land Trust working in our area, and those guys are fantastic, and we get along really great with them. And just kind of like how you see some of the differences in like a conservation district in an area like ours, approaching conservation easements. And our mission might be a bit different than looking at lands the same way Greenbelt would.
Sure. I can start. We do work in Benton County, and we maintain close communications with Greenbelt to understand what their priorities are geographically and regarding agricultural lands. And when we get requests from landowners for land protection, we always maintain close communication with Greenbelt and have actually had joint meetings with landowners with Greenbelt. And if it is in a gray area, it's up to the landowner. We recommend that they work first with their local land trust if it meets their needs. So, as a statewide, it's our goal to increase the amount of land protection, period, whether or not we hold the easement. And if we can do that by supporting our peers, then we do that. If a property is outside of Greenbelt's area, or the landowner is exclusively interested in protecting the agricultural values and not the habitat values, then we might be a better fit for them. And so, I'd be happy to talk with you or your board about our roles, and maybe even jointly with Greenbelt, so that we can share what each of our niches are. Nicole?
Nellie, I can always ask you later, so I'll let you go and I'll let Jim answer. You have a stop, you said. But I'm wanting to talk a little bit, or wanting you to talk a little bit about agritourism. And I know we see conservation easements as sort of a way to restore some of those eroding variances of VFU. But I know a lot of farmers who really feel agritourism is really important to diversifying and keeping their farm viable. So I know it's controversial and maybe we don't have enough time, but I'm curious on maybe any opinions on that. Jim, if you're talking, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Does any part of the panel want to answer that?
Yeah, I was waiting for Jim to speak up. I'm not sure if he's still here. I honestly don't think I can really talk to that with much knowledge, but yeah, probably emailing Nellie is a good place to start.
Okay. Sorry, Nicole, we don't have an answer for you right away, but might email Nellie then. We do have a question in the chat from Roger to Kelly specifically, how is climate change affecting the ability to provide wetlands?
That's a good question. There's a lot of things that are affecting our ability to manage wetlands. One thing we're having to take into consideration when we are looking at our restoration projects or project delivery is kind of a 50-year vision. However, like years like this year, it's a pretty good way to kind of start over. So if you have a moist soil impoundment, and for those of you that don't know what that is, it's basically where you manage water to ensure that certain plants and other food sources are getting the optimal amount of water during certain times of the year so that they can grow and provide a food source for in the fall. On a year like this, if those dry up, then it's usually a good time to start over. A lot of those moist soil impoundments need a working landscape, meaning you need to go in, maybe break up some of those roots and allow those plants to have a little more room to grow and provide food sources. Otherwise, they can compete amongst themselves and not function. But as far as restoration projects go, we're having to definitely take into consideration maybe increasing the depth of some of these wetlands or other factors that will at least give us a shot at getting ahead of the curve, but there's no guarantee.
I've got a question of my own for the panel. This is kind of a blue sky question, but is there a general threshold that, in size or value of an easement that just doesn't economically pencil out?
Yes. As Nellie mentioned, especially in Oregon, where we have pretty strict land use laws. I can mostly speak just for Eastern Oregon, but in the case where an EFU zone is like 180 acres. So if a landowner comes to us and wants to protect 180 acres in Eastern Oregon of EFU ground, or even 500, they're not really giving up very many development rights. And that often doesn't pencil out because a conservation easement value is very dependent on how many development rights are being given up. So for us in Eastern Oregon, we find that properties that are, I'll loosely say, over 1,000 acres are typically a little bit more worthwhile for landowners. And I think Nellie mentioned that land use laws affect property or conservation easement values on the west side a great deal. So, but I have much less experience on that side of the state.
On the west side of the state, it definitely is a factor. There's been a lot of landowners that have reached out to me wanting 20 or 40 acres. And if it is by itself, there's a lot of factors to determine what is a good conservation easement and what isn't. But usually the funding sources actually sometimes are a good way to filter that out, because certain funding sources are not going to want to take an easement that's 20 or 40 acres over here on the west side that is by itself. Now, if it is in connection with additional conserved lands, then that might be something that's more attractive to a funding source. But you definitely have to tell the story and why that's critical.
Right, thanks. And I think we got time for one more question. Claire?
Okay. Our district was approached a few years ago by the parties that had a wetland mitigation bank, and they wanted us to take over the administration of that bank. And one of the things that came up was climate change and how what was at one time a wetland may not be a wetland in the future. And were we getting into a mess by taking this on and saying that we would keep it in a wetland? Any comment on that, Kelly?
Um, that's a good one. And I think that's where you have to look at what type of a wetland are we talking about? Are we talking about something that is a wet prairie, or are we talking about something that is an actual kind of emergent marsh or floodplain? Those factors definitely need to be taken into consideration. But as far as like a wetland bank and taking over the ownership, that is definitely a tough one to do. Because you don't know necessarily what was done during the restoration or the thought process in going into the work that happened on the ground. You're simply going to be taking on the long-term stewardship of that particular parcel. And that could be a sticky thing if that ends up not being a wetland and it's, you know, growing weeds or other things, and the stewardship is a little more than you thought. Definitely we're, you know, looking at different landscape soils. All of those things can assist in figuring out whether that may not be a more wetland type habitat in the near future.
Yeah, well, the district decided not to do that, just, you know, for those type of reasons, but it was basically a wetland bench, a bench above a river, maybe 200 or 300 feet, but it was still a bench, and it was side hill wetland, and then the whole bench was just totally wet. And we just saw that the fact that there just might not be a water source that would do that, and avoided getting into that situation, especially with trying to, like you said, keep invasives, or actually keep a water source in there, and not having it change due to climate change. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, thanks again to all our speakers. It was a great panel. And I think we're coming up to a break now. So we'll take a break until 10:25. So about 17 minutes. Go ahead and leave your screens on if you like, and we'll be back at 10:25. I did hear that the Bloody Mary bar got canceled in the East Mezzanine, so sorry.
Wait, what? I was promised a Bloody Mary bar. Come on, Jim.
I got to do better.
Next year, maybe, huh?
We have three SWCDs that have working lands programs in place, and we're going to get presentations or discussion about those three programs. So I think the first one up is Andrew from East Multnomah, Andrew Brown.
Thanks, Jim, and hello, everyone.
Andrew, good to see you.
Let me see. You all seeing my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Yep.
Great. So I can't see you. If there's a question, please just interrupt. All right. Well, this is East Multnomah. Thanks to the Columbia, I have a large part of the Portland metro area. Our district goes up towards Mount Hood. The agricultural area we're talking about mostly today is this little area around the Sandy River, east of the urban growth boundary, which is the line in black here. We have our working lands program we call Land Legacy. Has two primary goals: to protect high value agricultural lands and also protecting high value natural resource lands and providing opportunities for people to access nature. Just in terms of the chronology of how it originated, I think after the district got its tax base in the mid 2000s, the board formed a committee of the board called the Land Legacy Conservation Committee at the time, and simultaneously established a special fund in the district's budget, a land conservation fund, which has supported the land conservation efforts and been the sole source of funding for all of our land protection efforts to date. Did the first project in 2009. It's in the Nadaka Nature Park in Gresham. Purchased the first and second farm properties in 2011 during the recession. First staffed up with a dedicated program manager in 2012. We formalized the program with more criteria and specific objectives. That was also aligned with trying to seek ASAP AL funding at the time. Then more recently, put time and effort into establishing standards and practices consistent with the Land Trust Alliance. Can't say, speak highly enough about the resources that they have and benefit that they've been to us. And finally got our first easement in 2018. These are some of the, these are the natural area projects that the district has funded, mostly open spaces and in the urban area. We do have two additional ones that are in progress. Actually, one's closing any day now, and another one that's a large forest parcel further out east. That's the Grand Butte Wetlands property. That's the Colwood property along the Columbia Slough. I mentioned that, but the focus of today is really on the working lands. So the rest of what I'll speak to here is about our working farmland protection program. And these are some of the objectives as we currently have them, which I'll run through individually. Excuse me, limiting farm conversion, like in the traditional reasons for doing easements is, stopping the development to non-farm uses. There's some mapping that I did a while ago. The farmland extent in 1948. We could get hold of aerial photos, and what's remained more recently, and you can see most of the high value ag soils in our district is under the urban area. Even since the land use program was put in place, there's been a drop in the acreage of land farms in the district. As Nelly and others have mentioned, the land use program does a great job of restricting development, but it slows and doesn't stop it. There's also the uses of EFU property, in particular non-farm uses that are allowed, and also a reason for doing this. Potential changes or weakening of the land use program, the expansion of the UGB, and East Multnomah also lost a couple of ag properties, I think, that have gone to houses as a result of Measure 37. Another big driver for our work is making sure that the farmland remains in farming. There's intense pressure being so close to the urban area for rural residential opportunities. In the estate buyers, there's some really huge, very expensive homes. You can see a couple of examples here in the district that are not bought by farmers for farming. They bought for their rural amenity value. Most of the higher or the larger pieces of ag soils with water rights isn't happening quite so much, but this shadow conversion is certainly putting pressure on land prices and resulting in a drop of actual farming in our area. Mentioning the farmland prices, this graph here is the values from the ag census going back. You can see from 92 to 2017, nearly 400% increase in prices. That's more than double the inflation rate. Would have been a good investment to buy ag land at that time. And these prices are really out of sync with what ag operations could actually generate and sustain, even for highly productive nursery operations. And it's certainly out of reach for most farmers, especially beginning farmers. So one of the things we do is try and keep farmland affordable and accessible. And that access is challenges us particularly acute for farmers of color and the demographics that have been, historically dispossessed and discriminated against. You can see that illustration here is to scale the size of the ag acreage that's managed by or owned by white farmers as opposed to all other races. Just 868 acres. That's for the whole of Multnomah County, not just our district. And then, of course, if we're going to protect ag land from development, there's also important to make sure that it gets looked after properly from a soil and water protection point of view. This picture here is one of the property's main stem. I'll talk a little bit more about later, what it looked like after the final harvest of the arborvitae nursery stock. It came under district ownership when we were able to improve the soil health and conditions on the site quite a bit. And then related to not the ag operations per se, but a lot of farm properties in our district also have areas of forests or riparian corridors. So it's an opportunity through this work to enhance and maintain the habitat, natural habitat that's on site as well. This is a photo of one of my colleagues, Lucas, planting our 500,000th tree as part of our stream care program on one of our properties. Where we focus this work, it's this area between the sandy and the urban growth boundary. You see quite highly parcelized already, dominated by the nursery industry. Specifically excluding this the urban reserve, which is land demarcated for the future expansion of the urban growth boundary. The idea being to align and complement the land use program and not contradict or conflict with it. These are some of the criteria we came with. I won't go through this. There's more information in the guidebook if you're interested, or please let me know. But criteria for determining the suitability of pursuing a project or some of the other balancing requirements. In reality, we've never had to really prioritize between two viable options. So this, whether to pursue a project or not, has really been a question of, is it high value ag land worth protecting or not? Did also do a prioritization of our areas on the individual farm tracts based on the soil value, area, slope, and water rights, and that's guided our work too. But again, it's really we started at the top in terms of outreach to landowners and have had limited opportunity or limited project opportunities that have arisen. So prioritization isn't super helpful in that context. the primary programmatic tools that we have, purchase of working farmland easements, and then the actual fee purchase of farm properties outright that are either sold subject to easements, the so-called buy, protect, sell, or held by us and made available to lease, through lease to farmers. Some of the easement provisions that we have in our easement templates, and not all of these get used for all easements, but trying to address those multiple outcomes that I've been through earlier. So farm must remain in active farm use, the so-called affirmative farming provision. No new residents or restrictions on a residential size, and that for us is really a key part of realizing easement value in our area. Limit the sale to a qualified farmer, or limit the sale resale to its agricultural value, so-called option to purchase at agricultural value. And then the habitat and resource protection measures that I've spoke about. All our easements also subject to agricultural management plans, and those are really separate documents that the easement enables, and is meant to cover the sort of operation-specific provisions that can change over time, updated at least every 10 years. So it includes, for example, the definition of productive ag use and some of the conservation practices or restrictions as part of that. Just a few other program pieces to mention. We do have a lot of guidelines and templates. These are just a few. If anyone's interested in learning from those, we're very happy to share them. That guides the work, and a lot of thought and effort have gone into these. So how have we done? This is the map, a map of our current holdings. This property over here is our headwaters farm where our incubator program operates. The other properties in yellow we own outright and fee, and the ones in orange are our easements. This one down here along Johnson Creek was a donated easement by that owner. These two were acquired through the sale. This is our Oxbow farm that was sold subject to an easement. To date, we've spent close on $9 million on the natural area and ag protection work. You can see the acreage and number of projects there too. I was going to run through a couple of case studies, but I see I'm out of time. Take a look at the guidebook, and this presentation will be available. Maybe just to mention with Mainstem Farm, I'll talk to one. It was a smaller 14-acre property, had an unrestricted home site authorization. The previous owner was looking to retire, no family interested in pursuing the operation. So very attractive to an estate buyer. The district purchased that and made it available for a short-term lease. The lease had kind of management a management plan associated with some restrictions. We expanded the riparian buffer. You can see the area in green here. Limited what could be done in this area of steep slopes. Some of the other provisions that I mentioned there. But key, we're in the process of extending that lease, a longer term lease with an option to purchase, and have done valuation work with the easement. And because of that home site authorization, the value of an easement restricting the size of the house or extinguishing that right completely is significant, and drops the price by like 60% of the value, which puts it into the realm of affordability for the farmer that's operating on the site to purchase. Some of the challenges generally we have as a program, I think the newness of easements and the kind of lack of familiarity with the growers in our area, taking a long time to kind of make the case. Then just the intensity of the non-farm buyers, escalation of land prices that certainly have had an impact, and that's impacted the viability of many of our ag operations generally, which just puts pressure on the continued use. I want to mention a couple of things. easement values and valuation. I think the land use program does a great job of limiting development. It also does a great job of limiting easement values. What Nelly mentioned earlier, the reality in our area is most of the farm parcels are below the size threshold that EFU or MUA 20 in our area dictates. So there is no opportunity for further subdivision. And for us, many of those parcels already have houses on them. Some of them are quite big. So really the easement value that we've been able to define comes down to whether there's a house on the site or not, and that right can be extinguished, or if you can limit the size. And that's about a third of our already quite limited number of ag properties out in our area. We've put time into appraising the non-traditional outcomes that a regular appraisal doesn't include, but things like ecosystem services or carbon sequestration. But the values that exist for those at the size of the property is also, it doesn't come close to making the easement value attractive to a landowner. Also to say, we are the reason why we layered those, one of the reasons we layered those additional easement provisions on, besides wanting to make sure that the protected parcels were well looked after, is to try and realize value out of the easement and make it a valuable proposition for a landowner. But that complexity also, there's a big trade-off between having a complex easement that's difficult to manage and enforce, and making it attractive to a landowner financially, and then having to deal with those additional burdens. That has really limited the opportunities to us. Nelly also mentioned the danger of doing easements with folks that are motivated by money, which has been the majority, the folks, all but one of the people that we have dealt with so far, really driven by funding considerations. So we, and we've had some growing pains as a result of that too, in terms of getting to clear expectations and refinements to our easements and management plans. The reality for us is we haven't been very successful at acquiring easements outright. We've really been limited in those opportunities. We haven't ever, as a program, been limited by available funding, but by actual project opportunities. I'd say the original focus of our work was on easement acquisitions, but the opportunities that have come about and that we've pursued has been through fee ownership, so-called buy, protect, sell. And then lately we've been thinking about accessibility for previously disadvantaged folks, so you have more options when you actually buy and hold lease, rather than try and sell those properties. So the valuation is a big thing and a big challenge. And then similarly, with that increasing complexity comes increased capacity to actually manage and enforce the provisions, both in putting them together and in monitoring and enforcing. I think there's a trade-off between having multi-outcome complex easements and the number of acres that you could actually protect with a simpler no development type easement. At the time and resources into managing those is not trivial. We have a full-time person and draw in the expertise of a bunch of other technical staff on staff with the district, and you use a significant chunk of the district's overall budget for this program. And even with the limited suite of properties that we have at the moment, it's a struggle to keep up capacity-wise. And then, related to that is going the buy, protect, sell route means you own properties outright for longer, which there's an extra burden with the fee property management, just managing leases, being landlords, fixing things when they break, all that kind of thing. I will leave it there. We can
All right, great.
questions at the end.
Yeah, we'll go through the 3 examples and then we'll have a discussion point at the end. So I've got a question in the chat from Stan Dean that will hold Stan to the end of our speakers here. So the next example from Yamhill is Larry Oja. Larry, you'd like to?
Hi. So it's great to scroll across. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
great.
Good.
So scrolled across the top of the screen to look at all the different names. It was really interesting to see some names that I've connected with over the years at OACD, and I look forward to someday when we're back in person. I'm not the best person on Zoom meetings, but I'll do the best I can. So, and I guess I'm going to start off by saying that the material I have is not quite like Andrew's. I don't have as many pictures. It's more of a narrative, but I do have a couple of maps and such. So I'm going to try to share my screen here and start with a map if I can find it here. So hang on just a second. There it is. Sorry for the, can you see that map okay?
I think we're seeing your screen with your file manager on.
Okay. Sorry.
No problem.
Let me try again here. How about now? You see that?
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Okay, so I thought maybe I'd start with a visual. So this is the Yamhill County, and which is our district covers the entire county. And just wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of the portfolio for a better word. And I'm going to talk. The purpose of this presentation is to talk about one example, which was our very first one, this Crown Hill Farms, which is a working lands easement. I know that's the focus, but I will say up front that we started this program back in 2000. We progressed to do different types of easements and different types of fee title ownership. But that gives you an idea of the coverage in the county when you look at that map. Some of them are very habitat oriented, some are ownership, some are easements. But today I'm going to talk mostly about the 720-acre Crown Hill Farm property. So I'm going to stop that for a second and try to share a different screen, which should be in the guidebook. Okay. And again, this is more of a narrative. Sorry for this quick scrolling. So I'm just going to kind of go along here and use this as my guide for discussion that we initiated our program clear back. It says 2002, but it was really before that when we started visiting with one of our longtime conservation district clients who had approached us in 2002 about holding an easement. This was a donated easement, and the objectives really for that person was to ensure the 720-acre farm and forest parcel would remain as one parcel in its entirety and remain as working lands, farm and forest. We've done a lot of conservation planning with this client, had a very good relationship with him. He had explored working with a few other organizations, and he really wanted to work with us locally. We didn't have a history of holding easements, so that was our first introduction, and actually got to work with a couple attorneys who provided some pro bono advice and helped us draft the conservation easement. But after about a 2-year process, we secured that easement on his property. Our responsibility on that property is conducting annual inspections on the property. I'll show you a couple of examples of the annual pictures we take and talk a little bit more about the annual inspection reports that we do. But it's mostly making sure that he's complying with the status of the easement requirements, or a future owner would. Photo documentation, and one of the provisions in this was having no more than a 2% average annual sustainable harvest yield on the timber he owns on the property. It has significant timber holdings. So we sit down with him once a year and review those receipts, and we talk to him more than once a year and kind of visit with him about his harvest plans and what areas need to be worked on. So we've got about 20 years into that particular easement, and it's going really well. He still owns the property. The reasons the district did that is we felt like holding this easement was actually just kind of the last step in the whole conservation planning process, and that we've done with him for years, and helping him meet his conservation objectives. But it also fit with our overall long-range plan objectives to protect farm and forestry land, to keep land in production, have a conservation plan on it, those types of things. We are a little naive. We didn't know how much time and capacity it would take, but this hasn't taken a lot of capacity because we don't own it. We're not responsible for the management of it. It's not real complex, so it's been reasonable in terms of the fiscal impact on the district to carry out our responsibilities. And I put insured a long-term commit to conservation that would otherwise be difficult to achieve if the parcel was subdivided. On this particular parcel, 720 acres, he had several pieces he could have knocked off and divided with 10 acres, some 20, some 40. So he gave up, as part of his estate planning, some significant value, which was one of his objectives, is to plan for his estate. So since that time, we've expanded our program to include additional easements. Right now we hold 4 conservation easements on a little over 1,200 acres. And we own 7 properties totaling 1,759 acres. We're currently working on 3 projects right now, so we'll be adding 3 ownership fee title properties to the portfolio within the next 2 years. Interesting that as you get into this, opportunities unfold. And so we've had opportunities to acquire properties through bequeaths, through donations, the funding through the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program, which is funded by Bonneville Power Administration. That's a program that's fit really well for our district because of the protection of some of the critical habitats that they want to focus on. We've been a really good fit. And again, that extension of conservation planning, we've worked with people on our oak restoration program it's funded by RCPP, USDA. So that's been a nice fit. We were fortunate to have some direct transfers from the Nature Conservancy to properties. Also, we had some history of working with the previous producers on, and we've had some life estate donations, which can be kind of complex. So maybe I'll talk about that later if you have questions. The purposes and the management plans and restrictions and public access, all these different things, they vary quite a bit depending on what type of transaction this is. But I would say that, these 3 things, protection of working lands, protection of habitat, and watershed protection, are often a common thread on a lot of these. Public access is an interesting one. And we were bequeathed the Miller Woods property, which is a 130-acre parcel that we received in 2004. And it was set up for conservation education, public access for those purposes, and experience in nature and sustainable forestry. So that particular property gets a lot of use. You've maybe heard the term loving something to death. I think we're starting to experience a little bit of that, where we've had times where we've had to, find extra parking. Even during COVID, we actually had to have appointments for people to come because of social distancing and some of the requirements to keep the numbers down. But that property in particular is a working lands property. We did a thinning on that property probably 6 years ago. Had to close it down during that time for safety reasons. But it gets a lot of public use, and so with that comes a lot of responsibility for keeping the trails open. We have probably 10 regular volunteers that donate hundreds of hours during the course of the year to help keep that property open. So it's kind of unique in that way. On the easement portfolio, I already showed you that map, but there's the numbers. We'll be taking on 3 additional property acquisitions through the Willamette mitigation program, totaling 635 acres. 2 of those are plan to close in December. Cross your fingers. And then there'll be 1 more that's approved. It's about 170 acres that will be worked on in the next 2 years. So one of the things I would emphasize is that partners are extremely important. And I think when I looked at some of the other presentations, Jason's presentation that will be coming up, he talked about partners as well. But early on, we worked a lot with the Trust for Public Land. Owen Wozniak was our key contact. He did a tremendous job of helping us understand a lot of things and training us and carrying the water on some transactions, both easements and acquisitions. We work closely with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Fish and Wildlife in Bonneville on that program I mentioned, WWMP. The Nature Conservancy. Some of our properties have an overlay of wetland reserve program, and that's funded through and managed by USDA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board has funded a couple of properties that have been transferred to us through Nature Conservancy. Early on, we worked with Columbia Land Trust as well, and others. I can't list everybody, but extremely important to seek out and prospect and culture a relationship with partners. So I know I'm going pretty quick because I only have so many minutes, but one of the things they wanted us to talk about was lessons learned, and we definitely have learned a lot of lessons. So to start with complexity, I saw this on Andrew's list too. I would suggest that as you get into this, if your district decides to get into this or your organization, that you really evaluate the complexity of a project, an easement, a donation, and use that to help evaluate whether your organization has the capacity to take this project on. You know, it can be very complex with reserved rights, covenants, life estate requirements. On Chagrin Farm, which is a working farm that we have a life estate arrangement on. If we could turn back the clock, I think we would more specifically design, design what a life estate really means and how both parties want that to work. Because in the deed documents, it just said granted as life estate to the grantor, and there are some standard definitions for that. But we do a lot of work on that particular farm to help out, and wanted to kind of negotiate how much of the land rent would go to one party and the other. And I think that's one lesson I learned on a life estate. I'd really sit down with the grantor to figure out what do we want that to look like for the first 5 years, the first 10 years, and so on. I think that would have made it easier for us. Relationship building. Excuse me. We've been approached about accepting properties from development companies and others that we haven't worked for. Sometimes they're looking for a paycheck. The best situations have worked out when we've had a long-term trusting relationship with the landowners and they understand what their conservation goals are. Ideally, we've worked with them as well. And it's not just a cash transaction. You know, this isn't our primary purpose as a conservation district. This is kind of an add-on to our normal things that we do to provide technical assistance, assist landowners find grants. So it works better for us when we find somebody that is patient, because they take a lot of time. We've had people want to come in and the first question they ask us is, I understand you guys buy property. How much money can I get? When can I get it? And that's not really how the district functions. Capacity. We've learned a lot about capacity and the needs for a project. It goes back to the complexity issue. There are costs to plan, protect lands can be significant. Our district has even though we're thankful for it, we have a very modest tax base, permanent rate. It generates about $300,000 a year. So as much as I'd love to be able to put a zero behind that and make that $3 million, we don't have that. So we have to look at long-term stewardship funding, donations. We've been very fortunate to get some donations. We received a donation on one of our gifted properties that we worked with Pioneer Trust Bank in Salem, and the donor actually made the donation to Pioneer Trust Bank to set up an endowment. So that worked out really well. But capacity, knowing what it's going to cost, and having a cash flow and a way to fund that's really important. I mentioned partnerships, finding people with expertise, everything from financing to volunteers to do project work to granting agencies to do restoration. They're all important. A couple more: risk management. You know, there is risk in owning property. If you're a landowner yourself, you know that, but I highly recommend, you know, you analyze the risk of issues associated with a particular transaction, whether that's an easement. On an easement, a good example of that would be, how many times is this property likely to turn over the next 50 years? Is it going to be one owner? Is it going to be 50 landowners? And that can eat your lunch if you've got a property you hold an easement on that's turning over land ownership a lot. So we're fortunate that we've got long-term sticking ability on those properties. Trespass, we're seeing more and more trespass issues. We've had our kind of first major vandalism at Miller Woods, Chagwin Farms, and others. So those things take resources, and they take a thoughtful approach of how you deal with trespass, how you deal with pollution and dumping of waste. We've had poaching and hunting issues on some of our properties. Fire management's another one that's becoming more and more of an issue for us to plan for. So I just think it's wise to look at the insurance requirements, the best management practices you're going to use to deal with risk. And I just listed a couple last things there. I mentioned it earlier, dedicated stewardship funding is important. We're fortunate, and we've made a decision to try to do a lot of the work ourselves. We have a full-time dedicated stewardship person and a seasonal stewardship person. And so we've got our own equipment. And we find that is valuable for a couple of reasons. One reason is we can't find contractors in a timely way sometimes. And number two, you get that institutional knowledge of having your own stewardship staff working on those properties year after year, and working closely with other people on our staff that write the management plans. So that's worked for us. On the WWMP program in particular, it can be interesting and time consuming and a little frustrating sometimes, but it's a great program if it fits. We've done 5 applications, so we're starting to get that figured out. And I think anytime you just, you know, have the experienced long-term staff to work on these programs, whether that's OWEB grants, WWMP, or simply just taking care of the properties and having that long-term relationship with the landowners is important. We also enroll many of our lands that we own into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners Program, and those folks have been really good to work with and actually just take on part of the project on the WRP portions of those properties. I included a map just to kind of show you the proximity and part of the county. So even though we don't go out necessarily prospect for particular properties, we try to be thoughtful in opportunities that come up to see if they connect. Like on this one down here, Dupey Valley, that this Masonville property was a donated property by the Nature Conservancy. We acquired this 540 acres through Muddy Valley through the WWMP program. And then we were fortunate, this Dupey Valley that we're hopefully going to close on in December was an additional 137 acres that came on the market. It was a really good fit. So we basically go from ridge through the drainage way to the ridge on this other side. So it's really a nice complex of properties that was fortunate to come together to meet the goals of the district and the landowners that made the contribution. So lastly, I'll just show you a couple of things. I mentioned photo points. This is at Crown Hill Farms, that's 720 acres. One of the things we do is we go out and we document to make sure there's not development on the property, that it hasn't been clear cut. And so we probably have a dozen photo points that we have before and after pictures, and we've been doing this for almost 20 years. So I just show you that as an example. some view shots. There's some areas of the homestead and the farmstead area as well. And with that, I'll stop. See if there's, because I took, I don't know, 15 minutes probably.
That's great, Larry. Thanks a lot. Those really good examples there. We'll go to the last example here from Jason Facera.
All right, thanks. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm Jason Facera. I am the Conservation Initiatives Manager with Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our working and natural lands protection work. Let's see here if I can get this slide to advance. There we go. So just a quick overview of the projects we've taken on so far. We have 2 properties that we own. They're Conservation Resource Center, which is a 15-acre farm in Beaver Creek, Oregon, that serves as our base of operations. That was constructed and completed in 2020. And then we've got our Eagle Creek Community Forest, which is a 317-acre working forest near Estacada along Eagle Creek. That's part of a complex of larger lands. You can see here in the picture that the orange area near the bottom is the Eagle Creek Community Forest, our portion of it, and the rest are the surrounding lands. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then we also have one easement. Larry's mentioned the WWNP program. We have a WWNP project as well, 181-acre late successional coniferous forest at Camp Adams, which is out near Colton. They've also got some oak woodlands, streams, and riparian forest and mixed conifer forest. So that's our lone easement at the district. So just to talk a little bit about the work at Clackamas, we have kind of an emerging program. Our work has come somewhat like Larry's in an opportunistic fashion. So we've just kind of over time built interest and relationships with folks and had some of these projects emerge from those relationships. So our working lands work is not formal. We don't have a formal program within the district. We have a committee, the Working and Natural Lands Protection Committee, that evaluates and makes recommendations on projects that then go to the full board to make decisions on. And then our staff from all of our departments contribute to property maintenance and management activities. So as we've started to through our actions, have a program, even though we don't have a formal program, we've started to have conversations with the committee about what are the areas of work in natural and working lands protection. And these are the areas that kind of rose to the top: land protection, habitat improvement, investment. So protecting those projects and relationships we've already developed with some of our landowners and protecting the projects that we've invested in. Working lands conservation and stewardship, working on generational land transfer, whether that's through helping with easements or even just providing resources to folks, classes, things like that, on how to keep farmland in production and transfer that to younger generations. Climate impact reduction, diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion, community engagement and education and advocacy and policy development, and then all of that supported by organizational capacity that's able to have a robust program. So these are the areas that we're looking to, as we start to develop a program, that we'll be looking at talking about where we want to prioritize and how we want to balance our portfolio of the work that we do when we do formalize a program. I've got a list of outcomes here. These are outlined in the guidebook as well, so I'm not going to go into great detail on them. But really, they're outcomes that are based on those 9 areas that we talked about. And these aren't codified yet. We still have some work to do as a district, over the next couple of years, to kind of get this program up and running. So to that effect, the district will be embarking on a district-wide strategic planning effort over this next 6 to 8 months. Hopefully by the next fiscal year, we'll have that pretty much well in hand. It'll be about a 3 to 5 year range plan to kind of balance that portfolio. Again, we've had a lot of really big projects, big investments. And so now trying to bring that in line with all of our other programs and really have a good balanced approach to conservation in Clackamas County. So these exercises that we've done to identify these outcomes will help seed the conversations that we're going to have at the strategic planning session. We're also going to reach out to partners in the community and other districts to talk about opportunities that they've had and lessons learned, and use those to inform us as well. And then again, we're going to try to really incorporate diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion into the program that we end up developing. So again, we're really kind of developing this program. Nothing's really formalized. We don't have, things we can share that are, hard and fast that we do to evaluate projects. We kind of evaluate them on a case-to-case basis. And really, like Larry said, it all kind of comes down to relationships. Most of the folks that have approached us, we have either had existing relationships with, or we've developed that in conversations about them wanting to protect land, but again, really trying to focus on people whose heart is in the conservation end of things and not on the profit side. So I just want to really quickly just spotlight Eagle Creek Community Forest. It's our biggest project in this realm as far as kind of a working lands focus, and it's really starting to take shape in our as it develops in our workflow at the district. So it's a 317 acre working forest, like I said, and it's part of a 100 acre complex of land that's managed for forest. So you can see it here in context. Over on the right side in green, you'll see the Mount Hood National Forest. Up to the north, you'll see Sandy and the scenic byway for Mount Hood. And then to the southwest, you'll see Estacada. So it's kind of nestled in between all those areas. And then closer in, you can see this orange property piece is our piece. And then it's surrounded by yellow is BLM, blue is the Clackamas County, and there's an Eagle Fern Park is there, a county park. And then purple is the PGE properties, private ownership that's managed for conservation. So just a little bit of background on the purchasing and financing. Trust for Public Land really helped us shepherd this deal with Weyerhaeuser. They did the due diligence and purchased the property and then transferred it to us as part of the grant, community forest grant process. And then helped us receive that grant award of $550,000 to offset the cost. So the community forest was came about through this grant, and so the grant really helped us cover some of the costs. The rest of it was funded through a loan that the district took on through Zion's Bank, and will be I believe it's the terms of that are for 10 years that we'll finish that loan up. So the community forest, because it's a U.S. Forest Service grant, there are requirements for what this needs to model. And the definition of a community forest is land owned in fee simple by an eligible entity that provides public access and is managed to provide community benefits pursuant to a community forest plan. And really what this means is, we're focused on community benefits and stewarding this to showcase a working forest. So economic benefits, environmental benefits, educational benefits, stewardship modeling is showing folks forest stewardship, and then recreational benefits, which is really a new realm for us as a district. Larry talked a little bit about the challenges of that, and we'll be embarking on that as we ramp this project up and open it more and more to the public. Just kind of a quick overview of the geography of the forest. We've got about 70 acres in late successional forest here highlighted in green. On the right side there, you'll see that's Cedar Creek, and that is a really productive spawning habitat. So a really great sensitive area, and one of the key factors that encouraged us to purchase the property. We've got some steep slope habitat on the edges of our north edges of our property that flow into Eagle Creek, North Fork Eagle Creek. And then we've got some aesthetic buffers that we're going to manage for along George Road, which is the main road, county road that goes by the property. And then we've got this core management area, about 221 acres of timber in various stages of development. So some of our local residents here, we've had wildlife cameras out there, and this will change, of course, as the forest develops. But it's great to see the wildlife, the diversity of wildlife that uses this property and the larger complex of forest. So it kind of validates that this is important property to protect from development and to keep in a working forest model. Some of the activities, road clearing. Again, with the forest, trying to make sure we can access the property for wildfire and other needs. So there was a little bit of neglect there when we bought the property from Weyerhaeuser, so we needed to go in and invest in some good road clearing and maintenance. This is the after of that clearing. Weed management activities along the road mostly. It's a pretty densely stocked forest, so really a lot of our issues are on the edges. And then some slash treatment from the results of some of that work. So overall, really the cost estimates for ongoing stewardship, we've spent $25,000 over the last 2 years since we purchased the property and just doing that vegetation management. And then there's staff costs. Larry mentioned, and so did Andrew, that staff costs are a big portion of the cost out there. You have to have a presence on the land. So, doing contract oversight, administrative activities, and all these other things results in the cost of staff time. And while that staff time is obviously a cost we already incur, it does pull from our other programs to be able to do the work on the forest. Other costs, there's some equipment costs and just some vehicle and wear and tear. There's some minimal costs there. But long term and as we go, annually we probably anticipate a $7,000 to $10,000 maintenance cost per year, with some additional project work, like this road clearing on the east side of the property that we're going to need to do to keep that road open as well. So definitely some ongoing costs. So what will the next 3 to 5 years hold at the forest? Our strategic planning process will help kind of guide the direction of our conservation work, in addition to solidifying financial and organizational structure. So this forest needs to operate with a long-term vision and strategy. But really we need a detailed operational plan right now that considers all of those factors that are important for both the economic and ecologic factors, but also the community benefits. So we're going to put a lot of effort into a very detailed operational plan. We need to formalize the roles of board, staff, advisory committee, and community. Again, this is a new realm for us, so that community piece is something, and the recreational piece is something that we're going to be grappling with and learning how to do, and then really leaning on partners to help us learn that what we need to do and get help where we need it. And then developing some recreational education opportunities focused on sustainable forestry, climate resilience, and wildlife habitat. So some lessons learned for us on the community forest, and maybe I'll mention a few others just in our dealings around land protection and management in general. Upfront costs. This definitely, the Eagle Creek Forest itself costs a significant portion of tax dollars. We're getting great benefit for a very important spawning habitat, and then also protected it from turning into housing, which is low density housing, which is what it was marketed for. But there's a cost to the taxpayers for that. And anyway, getting the Eagle Creek Forest grant was a great help with that, and certainly significantly cut that cost. But again, it's not like it was, it still costs a lot of money to get this forest up and running and in the district's portfolio. Ongoing maintenance costs, staff time is going to continue to, as I said, to be an issue. But there's also opportunity costs. When we're pulling staff from work that they were traditionally doing, there's a time lost that they either have to not take on new projects or have to kind of ramp down some of their existing projects in order to meet the needs of the forest and any other properties that we eventually purchase. So that's been a reality at our district for the last couple of years as we've started to manage both this and the Conservation Resource Center, and we're hoping as we get more and more familiar, we'll be able to transition them back to focusing on those other areas. And then the deferred income from harvest. We're not going to see revenue from our harvest activities out of this forest for some time, and then in fits and starts. So being able to have a plan for maintenance until that income comes in is important. Larry touched on a lot of the issues that owning property as a district you're going to face. The risk management piece, dealing with dumping, trespass, poaching, hazards, and emergencies. Just this last 2 weeks ago, our property was a lady who has either dementia or Alzheimer wandered onto our property and was lost, and the emergency services had to access the property. We don't maintain a presence on the land daily, so when they contacted us the first time, we were able to get them in, by contacting a neighboring property who had keys, but then they needed to enter after hours on a Friday, and they tried to call the district, no one answered, so they basically pulled our gate, which was frustrating, and so we're dealing with kind of with that outcome now and trying to figure out why they decided to do that instead of just cutting the lock, or there's all these things that come with land ownership that especially one that you're not on every day, that you just have to deal with, and it's a new realm for us. Recreation, again, is also a new frontier. We're going to lean heavily on our partners with Clackamas County and other folks who do recreation to help guide us. There's talk of a trail system out there at Eagle Creek, and we want to do that in a way that's ecologically responsible and doesn't interfere with our goals for stewardship out there. And then the community forest grant requirements. There were some grant requirements that were surprising in that, again, they don't want folks to transfer this, but there are some very stiff prohibitions on transferring the land. Even if we were to put an easement on it to still protect it as working lands and try to sell it, we would actually owe the federal government the cost of that transaction. So more than they gave us in the grant, we'd owe them the cost of the sale of the property. So, and that's in the deed. So, those types of requirements are, restrict the land a little bit more. And, while it's not a challenge or not an issue now, if the district were to have some issue down the road where we, had to choose between, staff and the forest, we may have to really get creative and to not lose staff. So I mean, any restrictions can be a challenge, and so that was an interesting outcome from the community forest as well. But some great impacts. We're able to achieve local communities' goal for protecting the forest from development, and it's an important piece of a larger contiguous forest with valuable habitat. And we hope that it will be a model for sustainable forestry and climate resiliency that we can share and really show our customers and folks the value of stewarding lands in a way that meets multiple needs. So that's most of the lessons learned. One other lesson learned I could say from the WWMP side is that, Larry mentioned complexity, and we originally had asked to do a project with a WWMP project that was approved on a property that had 8 landowners on one parcel, and just the sheer complexity of that ended up making the deal not come through in the end. And so really, finding projects that are consummate to your level of understanding and ability to deal with those complexities is important. So that was another lesson learned that was difficult, but we certainly learned from that experience as well. So that's generally what the district in Clackamas has been up to as far as this, and I just appreciate the chance to talk about what we're doing and look forward to questions.
All right, thanks, Jason. Those are all 3 really good examples there. I'll read, Sandine had a question after Andrew's talk, and it applies to farming activities. He asked if an SWCD holds an easement that requires active farming, what happens if the owner says, I can't do this anymore? So what is the means of enforcement?
Yeah, good question. In our easements, the way we've handled that is that the easement grants the right to the district to step in and lease the property out to someone who will farm it after a period of time passes, to give the landowner the chance to meet that affirmative farming obligation. The other mechanism, though, is also what constitutes that adequate level of agriculture is defined in the management plan as a productive ag use definition. And so if there was ever anything, wide economy or disaster related, you could always, by mutual agreement, define down what that means and not trigger that provision in terms of the delay or minimal use. I will say that affirmative farming obligations really came from experience on the East Coast with ag protection easements that resulted in lack of development, but also people that wanted to live out in the country buying those properties and then not farming them, so not contributing to the ag ag economy or viability. So that's where that came from.
Very good. I've got another question in the chat from Michael. That real estate transactions are complicated and require lots of skill that most SWCDs don't have. Can you talk about how you got help in these transactions, or if you hired someone on staff with background?
I can speak a little bit to what we did on the Eagle Creek Forest. We leaned really heavily on trust for public land, but we also engaged a land use attorney, Fritz Paulus, that helped us with some of the other pieces of the transaction. And then when we were developing our WWMP project, they had some resources and some folks that we could work with ODF&W that helped with some of those transactions as well.
Yeah, and I'll mention that you know, on our WWMP, the first couple ones we did, we had Trust for Public Land help us. You know, I kind of did an understudy, you know, with Owen and took a lot of notes and learned some things. And then we have a very good relationship with one of our title companies, and the person that's been there for a long time has a lot of institutional knowledge. He's been really a good mentor for me and has taught myself and others on staff about due diligence and all the things that go along with real estate. Dick Duncan at ODF&W, that's probably who Jason's talking about. He's helped us with some of our purchase sell agreements on WWMP, and even on one that we did a kind of a creative buy purchase sell agreement that had a option to buy it, and Dick helped me with crafting that as well. So, and then I think, you know, the other person, Jana Holm from TNC, the Nature Conservancy, she helped us through a lot of the steps when we did the Muddy Valley transaction, and I worked closely with her when they actually made a donation to us. So again, I'd build relationships with people that can help, whether that's, you know, on a volunteer basis or partner agency, or even just, you know, a good relationship with a title company or a land an attorney that's got the kind of skills that you would need. But yeah, there are a lot of things with due diligence that you don't want to miss.
I can add there what we've done is employed somebody with extensive land trust experience doing property deals. So that's helped, and use a couple of attorneys on a regular basis to, you know, make sure all our documents are correct. Yeah, some of the natural areas work we've done have also been in conjunction with Metro and the City of Portland, Trust for Public Land. So learned from there and their property folks as well.
Okay, we've got another question here from Dean. What are the presenters' thoughts about buying an ag easement within the urban growth boundary or urban reserves? Those easements are expensive, risk conflict with regional planning efforts, and also risk having a farm that becomes surrounded by development, and so might be difficult to keep in production.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, our district took a policy choice not to do that. I think for a few reasons, but the primary one is the land use program is so effective at protecting resource lands, and we didn't wanted to complement and not conflict with that. Although there's an assumption that our easements are going to help stop the expansion of the urban growth boundary at some stage in the future. But there's also, if you protect ag land inside the urban growth boundary, it gets surrounded by urban development. You're also taking that out of the acreage available for urban growth, which only puts more pressure on expanding the growth boundary sooner, so that there's sufficient available land. There's also a practical consideration: is this any significant acreage in the urban growth boundary is way more expensive, and just would be completely out of reach at the kind of resources that we have or we've been talking about.
And I would say that it's kind of outside our scope. We don't have a large bankroll to be able to go out and craft a deal for something like that. Our Chagrin farm was actually partly in the UGB on the edge of McMinnville. And I can tell you that the city planning director is not very happy with us, but that was the landowner's decision. We didn't go out and buy that. He wanted it to stay in ag. That's the property we have a life estate on, but I could see how it'd be fairly controversial and expensive. And so it's just something our district isn't in the mix. Right now it's easier for us and more practical for us to put our limited resources on protecting other properties that aren't in the UGB. But we do have Chagrin Farms that took some land out of the UGB that McMinnville would have developed. But that was the decision of the previous landowner. We didn't purchase it.
Yeah, and in the case of Clackamas, we kind of have done similar to Andrew. We don't want to conflict with the planning efforts. We feel like there is a role for us in those lands, and promoting open lands or areas, but not really holding easements or acquisitions for those purposes. We still want people to develop with minds toward a mind towards wildlife habitat and other uses that are open space. So there's a role, but maybe it's not easements and acquisitions. And we want to protect the best farmland. So like in our case in Clackamas, some of the areas where we have that conflict, where folks want to keep it in farmland, but it's within the reserves, it's not maybe the best farmland. So our capital is better spent somewhere else, making sure that areas that have the infrastructure and really want to protect that infrastructure where it's already existing can, that's a better frontier for us to do work than maybe an area that's already in conflict and maybe doesn't have good infrastructure and is already experiencing some mix of uses, more urban maybe than rural in character.
I would add that that land that's outside the UGB, but in the future path, at some point, whether that's 10 years or 100 years, that's a place where you can have a conversation. For example, on the west side of McMinnville, a couple very large farms that will be in the path at some point. And I think there are a couple considerations. One, if you wanted to try to shift the growth in the direction of the UGB, you could maybe try to craft something there for ag land protection, but plan it in a way that you didn't get surrounded in the future. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but in the parcel I'm thinking about, if that was to be protected, we'd want to go far enough and big enough where we didn't end up having this island, in 100 years. So just a thought.
Larry, I got a question on that example you provided there. We're working with a landowner that's within a UGB boundary, but the property is zoned under the city planning for ag forestry, and it has limited building potential under their own zoning. What was that example of that you had there, where part of your easement is within a UGB? What was that zoned?
That's a question for me, Larry.
Yeah.
So on that's Chagrin Farm, and it was in the UGB. It hadn't been brought into the city, so it was still zoned agriculture when the life estate arrangement was crafted. So we continue to have it in agriculture. It's working lands, and fortunately, and we're not going to get surrounded on that particular piece of property because it's bordered by the Yamhill River. So we pretty much protected everything from where the hard line is on the current city to the river. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it was zoned ag.
Yeah, that does. I got looks like time for one more question here from Terry. In the Portland metro area, do you work with metro regional government on any ag easements, since they're mostly in charge of land within the UGB and potentially expanding the boundary of that UGB?
I cannot speak to our experience there. So no, we haven't worked with them directly on ag easements. We've tried to encourage them to put some of their funding towards ag land protection. We have worked closely with them on a number of natural area projects. I think they've been reluctant to go direction of ag easements because they hold the UGB process and responsibility for that. So it seemed to be like, working two ends of the same thing. Yeah, we have worked a little bit with Metro in terms of what to do with the ag acreage that they hold, that came with areas of on the same properties of natural areas that that they've purchased or acquired as part of their net area bond work.
All right, great. Well, thanks to the three of you, Jason, Larry, and Andrew, for some great examples there. And I think those are all included in the guidebook. So if people want to look at more detail of that, I suppose they could contact you.
And I encourage everyone to read that guidebook. It's really great. And a lot of work went into it. So thank you.
Yeah, so our next portion here will actually be an overview of the guidebook by Jan Lee.
Hey, Jan, you're muted.
I plan on just doing a quick preview so that you can address that on your own later. But the Working Lands program is very important to me. I'm a member of the board of the Clackamas SWCD and our chair of the Working Lands Committee. So we've done a lot of work in that area, and that will be something as we address our strategic plan that I expect we will continue working on. Okay. Dropbox is making me sign in because I had a major computer disaster this morning when all of a sudden Microsoft 11 popped up on my computer and wiped out a lot of my stuff. So it'll be just a moment. And I'll screen share with you.
That's harsh, Jan. Thanks for still showing up today, even with that kind of a disaster on a all-day virtual conference. We really appreciate you.
Yes, tomorrow things will be better. Okay, so can you all see the screen? Do you see the opening page of the guidebook, hopefully?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So one thing that's important for me to point out is that our Oregon Conservation Partnership helped to pay for this project, and we will be sharing it with them. That's the councils, the land trusts, and all of our districts. So what I wanted to really point out was just a few key things. Jim Johnson went over the definitions. The other thing that I'd like to point out in section 1 is that there are a number of protection programs. For example, goal 3 protects ag lands. Goal 4 protects the forestry lands. And there's another provision in DSL that protects the wetlands and what they call blue carbon areas. So when we get to section 1 is mainly the background. And then when we get to section 2, it talks about building working lands projects in your district. One thing I might mention though at the end of section 1 is this issue about succession planning. And if you take a look at that and see what the average age of some of the farmers is, that's a little scary, and that maybe pushes us to do our programs a little sooner. I think we have the authorization clearly as soil and water districts to hold conservation easements. But if you're looking at going forward to do one, I think the board and the staff need to sit down together and address a number of questions. Like, do you have the financial capacity? Do you have the staff capacity? And you have to know, as it was mentioned by Nellie, that this costs money because you've got to have professional services. And I believe Nellie quoted $45,000 to $50,000. Another important area for districts is working with land trust partners. And if you haven't developed an easement program before, maybe your first venture might be to work with a land trust who has the capability to provide all of the segments of the work that need to be accomplished. They can seek donations from people they can bring the appraisal to the table, look at the tax consequences, and help you with legal agreements. The Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts is one of our core partnership members. And if you go to their site, they have all kinds of documents that may be useful. And you heard from Nellie about the Oregon Agricultural Trust and how they deal with working lands. The Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts has a number of land trusts around the state. And if you go to the guidebook, you can find one that's in your area. In addition, there's a couple national associations, and on their sites, they have all kinds of different tools that might be helpful to you. Then when we get into section 4 of the guidebook, that's where we discuss the various programs for funding, all the way from the federal programs of several different types to the Farm Bureau programs, the New America, the Beautiful program. And then we get to state programs, which are pretty thin at the moment. And Nellie talked about the agriculture ACEP ALE program. Oregon is actually 41st in the number of dollars that have been received for this program. So we've got a lot that we need to do in that area. There's a good number of regional programs. At one time, our district had a program that would have been in the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program. And unfortunately, due to the landowners, that fell through. But that's a resource that you might look at. At the state, we've got the OWEB program, but that requires that there be a fishery component or some link to the Oregon Salmon Plan. The Oregon Agriculture Heritage Program would be ideal, except it hasn't been funded since it was implemented in 2017. There's a group of us working on getting some funding for that right now. And if we don't get it in the short session, we will find a way to get it in the long session in 23. Land trusts, of course, do have access to funding to help. And you just heard from our 3 districts, and this section of the guidebook provides all of those materials that they talked about. So you can go through there and look at what they've shared with you, and then contact one of those 3 folks if you have questions. Sorry for giving you a rough ride. Hope nobody's getting sick at this point. And the last chapter of the guidebook really deals with regenerative agriculture and carbon sequestration as climate mitigation projects. So we're working with landowners to forward these kind of practices on the ground because we've really got to change where we are with the climate situation. Yesterday, Ron Alvarado referred to the USDA Climate Adaptation and Resilience Plan. There's a link in the guidebook to that, as well as the Climate Smart program in the last 90-day report. So you could take a look at those for guidance. There's also this interesting program from the Climate Hub. It's called the Future Crop Suitability Web Tool. And it will show you certain areas of the country, including specific areas in Oregon, where there's guidance for planting particular crops that have more durability. The USDA climate hubs cover the US, and we're in the Northwest Hub. And if you sign up at the Northwest Hub, excuse me, you will get their emails and you can participate in various forums. This is a linkable map where you can look at the federal programs for financing. So if you were to click on your county, it would give you access to the people that are in charge of the program and how it would be able to assist you. We're looking at carbon sequestration programs, and there appears to be 2 pathways. We can go to USDA's and the state program funding, public funding, or as you saw yesterday from Jason at Truterra, there are private markets being developed as well. On the federal funding side, there is this entity that most of us don't really know much about. It's called the U.S. Commodity Credit Corporation, and it's funded by the federal government, about $100 million worth, and it's renewed annually, and Congress has no control over it. In fact, the head of the corporation is the Secretary of Agriculture. So there is a current plan in the federal administration to take $3 billion out of that over the next several years and provide projects for carbon sequestration as well as other drought resilience. In the state funding, we could have the Oregon Agriculture Heritage Program if it was funded. In the short run, we're looking at putting in $5 million to take care of a backload of easements. There's about $50 million in easements that are ready to go with some funding. But in 2023, we're going to be talking with the legislature about bringing sequestration into that program as well. That was one of the goals that was cited in the Oregon Global Warming Commission report that you heard about yesterday. The state also has another capability in that they can create what's called a green bank using the state's bonding authority. So that may be something that could be coming forward in the future. They also have what's called the Oregon Forest Resources Trust. That's headed under the Oregon Department of Forestry. And that program actually has authority for the Oregon Department of Forestry to do their own sequestration marketing program, their own offset program. But just like OAHP, that's sitting there with very little money in it. And then you heard yesterday about private markets. So we continue to work with the Oregon Global Warming Commission to be able to get a sequestration program completed at the state level. There's lots of work to be done, as you heard yesterday. But the legislature, some of the key legislators in natural resources seem to be interested in moving a program forward. And as you heard, there is not only the idea of funding the state agencies to support the work, but in the work development program that they're looking at, that would even have the potential to add some staff at soil and water districts or other entities to do the technical work. So with that, I've given you a quick overview, and I hope you'll take the time to take a look at the guidebook, and you can address any questions to me that you have in the future. If you are on this call, you are registered for a conference and you should have received a copy of the guidebook last night. If for any reason you didn't, you can just give me an email and I'll be sure to get one to you right away. This will be on our member website, so any member of OACD will be able to go to the members portal and download it as they choose. Oops. So I'm not seeing the stop screen share button, which isn't nice. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if anyone has a question right now, I'd be glad to address it or send me an email later. Okay, we get to have a longer lunch hour then. Thank you.